Chapter 609. The two sides were separated by a great distance, but they could clearly see each other's expressions. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and confirmed the other party had left. He couldn't help but shake his head. A wave of exhaustion that was difficult to suppress surged into his heart. After being chased by the Western Hu pack of wolves for 3 days, both sides had exhausted themselves. Since the other party had given up, he would not feel any disappointment. There was only relief. After waiting for 3 days, the pursuit that had been going on for 3 days seemed more like a child's game. It was not very dangerous, and neither side had even pulled out their knives or shot an arrow. But in reality, both sides knew what this pursuit represented and what kind of danger it hid. Fan Xian and his group entered deep into the grasslands and confidently left. Although they had not truly fought, they had left a deep shadow in the hearts of the Western Hu people. Many years ago, the Qin Kingdom's largest border expansion operation had also been carried out under the secret leadership of the Overwatch Council. Even now, the person called Chun Pingping was still a legend on the grasslands who was treated like a demon. Fan Xian's trip to Western Hu could be considered to have continued the Overwatch Council's excellent tradition. After taking over, he arrogantly patrolled the territory. This was a heavy blow to the spirits of the people on the grasslands. The Western Hu court wanted to unify the grasslands and fight against the Qin Kingdom, but they could not keep a group of people deep in the grasslands. Presumably, this would allow them to have a clearer understanding of their own strength. It would also make the Western Hu tribe, which had been incomparably glorious these 2 years, more careful when sending out troops. Chief Subida had chased for 3 days in vain and was forced to turn back gloomily. He looked helpless and sorrowful, but in Fan Xian's eyes, there was a different meaning. This master of the grasslands had retreated so resolutely. This kind of courage to give up and being able to suppress the Hu rider's warlike nature was truly an oddity on the grasslands. If this person, with Haitong's help, truly unified the grasslands, he would probably become a great danger to the Qin Kingdom. Fan Xian blinked his eyes. His long eyelashes were covered in dust. He looked like a native toying with the warriors of the grasslands in the palm of his hand. However, he was not very happy. On the contrary, he appeared lonely and helpless. "Let's go." He pulled on the reins and rode toward the bottom of the meadow under the setting sun. The warhorse beneath him was jubilant. Although it looked like the pursuing soldiers of the court had retreated, the Black Knights still did not relax. Who knew whether or not the ruthless Western Hu people would create a false impression and then attack from the side and rear? On the grasslands, the Hu people had the help of eagles. It completely nullified the effectiveness of the circular telescope in Fan Xian's hand. Because of this, the group of people who had escaped from the grasslands still did not dare to slow down. They forcefully supported their exhausted bodies and urged their war horses, which were soaked in medicinal sweat, to gallop towards the east. It was not until 7 days later that the group entered the entrance of Hong Mountain that they were truly relieved. Red Mountain was a very strange terrain in the eastern part of the grassland. It was formed by natural piles of earth and stone. After thousands of years of north wind, it had been cut into isolated mountain peaks. The mountain peaks were all crimson red. They looked as shocking and murderous as the imperial calligraphy in the imperial study. The path to enter the pass was at the bottom of these red mountains. It was a winding path that resembled sheep intestines. Fan Xian walked at the front of the group and accepted the leather pouch Jing Ge handed him. He drank a mouthful of water to moisten his sore throat. In a raspy voice, he said, "After finishing things here, I'll have to lie in bed for 2 months when I return to the capital." A rustling sound came from the red mountain. It seemed that someone had stepped on the sand and stones on the mountain. Jingga couldn't help furrowing his brows. Fan Xian knew what he was thinking and laughed loudly. However, because of his throat, the laughter was particularly unpleasant to hear. The Qin Kingdom's Western Expedition Army, lying in ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain, looked extremely tired to have allowed their group to catch such an obvious sound. The sound of horse hooves rang out from the valley ahead. The dust-covered crown Prince Li Hongcheng led the Dingzhou army over to welcome them. Li Hongcheng squeezed his horse's belly and came to Fan Xian's side. Looking at Fan Xian's wretched appearance, he couldn't resist shaking his head and said, "I told you long ago, Su Bida is an ambitious and ruthless figure. How could he be tricked by you?" Fan Xian glanced at him and said, "At least I brought him out for 6 days. These 6 days are enough to do some things. Is there need to be so careful just to kill the northern Qi people in the court?" Li Hongchang glanced at him disapprovingly. After confirming that the kid was unharmed, he relaxed and continued, "Did you fight with the Western Hu people?" "No, I just moved my feet." The two groups met together. Their power immediately increased. In a moment, they had left the mouth of Hong Mountain, which contained thousands of years of wind and sand. In order to hide the news and prevent anyone from reporting it to the Western Hu court, there were 8,000 Qing elite soldiers lying in ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain. They were all close relatives of the general's manor, as well as frontline soldiers in Qingzhou. They had not gone through Dingzhou to make any large movements. "We've waited here for 7 days and haven't seen anything. Shouldn't the Overwatch Council give us an explanation?" Li Hongchang pressed his blistered lips together. "Forget it." Fan Xian gently squeezed his horse's belly. There wasn't a spot on his body that wasn't sore. He glared at him and thought to himself that the ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain was just a preparation. Who could say for sure how strong the chief's jealousy was? Furthermore, this place was still a few days away from Qingzhou. Instead of rushing back, they were still arguing endlessly. It was truly a very risky thing to do. What he was concerned about was the situation inside Dingzhou. Have they acted? I left before they acted. The governor's manor is cooperating with your subordinates. I've given military orders, so don't worry. Li Hongcheng looked at him and said, "Although I don't know the specifics, there have been reports coming in over the past few days. The operation should be going smoothly. The northern Qi spies in Dingzhou have basically all been pulled out by your subordinates." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything more. After this battle, the grasslands once again sank into chaos. Most importantly, one Overwatch Council had entered the grasslands while the other was scattered in Shiliang Road. They had successfully wiped out all of the spies the Northern Qi Emperor had buried on this vast battlefield. The ruthless methods Ku he had used before his death, the excellent situation that the Northern Qi Emperor and Haidang had used 2 years to construct, had turned into a bubble because of his even more ruthless and shameless response. 4 days later, nearly 10,000 of the Qing elite troops finally withdrew from the grasslands and entered Qingzhou. This group of soldiers had not fought a single battle with the Western Hu riders. They had completely served as the backdrop for the Overwatch Council's actions. Their morale was not as high as when they had set out. Additionally, they had endured for too long at the mouth of Hong Mountain. They looked like defeated soldiers. The mental state of the Black Knights of the Overwatch Council was not much better. If it were not for the fact that they wanted to give Fan Xian face, these people would probably immediately fall to the ground and fall asleep. Once they entered Qingzhou, Fan Xian immediately ordered the Black Knights to rest. Jinggu accepted the order and left. However, they could not immediately bathe and eat. First, they had to take good care of the hundreds of horses specially trained by the Overwatch Council. The medicinal power in these horses' bodies had already begun to recede. They could not hold out much longer. If they were not quickly treated, they would probably gradually die. These hundreds of human-like military horses were the saviors of the Overwatch Council's Black Knights. No one wanted to see them finally fall into such a tragic state. However, everyone knew that after this 1,000-li run, this group of black horses would never be able to recover their original spirit. Inevitably, they felt a bit sad in their hearts. Fan Xian followed the army of the Western camp and met the suspicious gazes from both sides of the road in Qingzhou. The soldiers and merchants had guessed this young man's identity. They also guessed that the court must have carried out a major operation on the grasslands. Looking at the tired and listless appearance of the Dingzhou army, everyone thought that the court's operation on the grasslands had failed. The gazes they turned toward him were strange. Fan Xian and Li Hongcheng had just entered the Qingzhou military yamen when Yi Ling-er, who had received the news, rushed back from the palace walls. Rushing into the back room, She pushed open the door and angrily said, "Do you think you're a god? How dare you bring so few people deep into the grasslands? Aren't you afraid the Hu people will eat you alive?" Yiling had her own reason to be angry. Although Fan Xian had not lost anything this time entering the grasslands, in reality, he had taken a great risk. Thinking of this, anger rose in Yiling heart. If Fan Xian died on the grasslands, what would happen to Lin Wan? What would happen to the two children? As Lin Wan's bosom friend, she had sufficient reason to give the harshest criticism of Fan Xian's rash actions. Of course, there was another reason she was angry. Fan Xian had come to Qingzhou, but had not come to see her. He had hidden such an important matter from her. Fan Xian paused with wisps of mist in his eyes as he watched the young lady of the Yi family break through the door and enter. His gaze unconsciously moved from the light armor on her body to the familiar and beautiful face. His heart was slightly moved. He knew that she was indeed concerned about his safety. However, looking at your appearance, you want to eat me alive even more than the Hu people, he said with a worried expression. Wang Fei, Hongsheng and I aren't wearing clothes. You don't have to be so anxious, do you? After entering the Qingzhou military yamen, Fan Xian and Li Hongsheng, who were covered in wind and sand and sore all over, had used their power and position to immediately prepare 2 large buckets of hot water. They were soaking comfortably when unexpectedly a woman barged in. Furthermore, her identity was special. Yiling had grown up in the Dingzhou army. Her personality was bold and forceful. She was very different from other women. Hearing Fan Xian's words, she realized that Fan Xian and Li Hongsheng were naked and curled up in the large wooden buckets. These two people still wore purposefully shy expressions on their faces. It was very annoying. On the contrary, she was not embarrassed or angry. She just spat at the side of her feet and elegantly turned to leave. On the grasslands, the left virtuous prince had been assassinated. Something had happened to the court. It was certain to sink into chaos. As the head of the Qing court's military stationed in Shiliang Road, Li Hongsheng had to quickly report this matter to Jingdou. At the same time, he had to return to Dingzhou to hold down the camp and move military power in order to deal with the newest change in the situation on the grasslands. Thus, the next day, he left Qingzhou. Fan Xian stayed. It was not because of the good scenery in Qingzhou or because of Yiling. It was because he wanted to wait for a few people to return before he could truly relax. After a few days, the Central Plain merchant group Fan Xian had mixed in and finally returned to Qingzhou covered in dust. Calculating the time, this merchant group had traveled very quickly. The path the merchant group took on their return journey was not the same as the path Fan Xian had taken. On the contrary, they had missed the soul-stirring chase. Seeing this group of merchants return safely, Fan Xian's mood relaxed slightly. He had been worried that because of the Overwatch Council's actions, these merchants from the Central Plain would become the target of the Hu people's revenge. Unexpectedly, the Hu people, under their rage, were still able to resist attacking the merchant group. It looked like Haitong's teachings these 2 years on the grasslands and the chief's decisions about the future had already affected many people. Soon after, a lonely shepherd who had lost his cows and sheep and was unable to continue living on the grasslands also entered the city of Qingzhou. However, no one knew that in this half a year, this lonely shepherd was playing the role of a mute servant who was used to hunching his body. The shadow had also returned safely. Fan Xian's heart relaxed a great deal. However, there was still no news from 13th Wang. He didn't know what his situation was, which worried him greatly. Although the Overwatch Council was used to using sinister methods to deal with all enemies, any method needed a powerful executor. Fan Xian himself was a powerful ace. He also had the Shadow as his subordinates. If it weren't for these terrifying generals, even if he had lured Haidang and the chief away, he would not have been able to achieve the Overwatch Council's goal. The Northern Qi people in the court would be dealt with by the Shadow. The left virtuous prince, who had to die, needed another powerful warrior. Fan Xian had always been troubled by this. There were only a dozen top aces in the world. It was not until a long time later that he sent a probing invitation to 13th Wang through Baoyue brothel. After the Dong Mountain incident, 13th Wang had been serving the heavily injured and dying Sigu Jian in the sword hut in Dongyi. However, Sigu Jian miraculously dragged on and did not die, so 13th Wang never appeared in front of people again. Although Fan Xian and 13th Wang had an agreement 2 years ago, he didn't know if it was still in effect. Thus, this invitation was only a test. 13th Wang did not reply to a single word of this invitation. He directly left Dongyi and came to Jingdou to find Fan Xian. Fan Xian, the Shadow, and 13th Wang, the three aces, went deep into the grasslands. They each had their own duties. In terms of the execution power represented by top aces, the present Overwatch Council was even more terrifying than when Shun Pingping was in power. It was because of 13th Wang's arrival that Fan Xian made up his mind to enter the grasslands. Because this person's identity was too special, Fan Xian didn't want the palace to be too suspicious of him. Thus, he purposely hid his identity along the way. He only brought him into the merchant group and then separated. He still didn't understand why 13th Wang was still willing to continue the previous agreement after Sigu Jian had been beaten into a cripple by the emperor. He didn't have time to think about this. He only hoped that 13th Wang would be able to return safely after assassinating the Western Hu's Wuxin Queen. After a few days, Fan Xian finally received the news he had been waiting for. More accurately speaking, everyone knew of 13th Wang's return. Unlike the Shadow's quiet return, the return of this 13th disciple of the Sword Hut startled the entire Qingzhou. That day, the scorching sun hung high in the sky, shining down on Qingzhou City, causing the biting cold autumn wind to completely lose its temper. The green bricks at the city gates seemed to be about to emit smoke, and just like that, a bloody man walked through the city gates of Qingzhou City. The soldiers of Qingzhou looked warily at the bloody man. Holding long spears in their hands, they surrounded him. Enveloped by the coldness and murderous intent emanating from the bloody man's body, fear grew in their hearts. The man wore a Hu people's fur jacket. If the leather jacket with more than 30 cuts could still be considered a leather jacket, endless amounts of fresh blood seeped out of the holes in the leather jacket. It solidified, spread, and covered his entire body. No one knew how long the bloody man had walked on the grasslands. The bloody wounds had already begun to fester. Flies and mosquitoes danced around his body. It looked strangely wretched. The Qingzhou guards didn't know who this person was. They only knew that for him to be able to walk out of the grasslands with such heavy injuries, he was certainly no ordinary person. The man opened his eyes. His lips were covered in bloody blisters. To the soldiers surrounding him, he said, "Tell Fan Xian that I have done what I promised him." Receiving the news, Fan Xian rushed over and supported him. Looking at the wounds on his body, his heart was filled with a chill. He was responsible for luring out the chief and Haidang for the operation on the grasslands. In the end, Haidang would not kill him. Furthermore, the Shadow had acted silently and did not take much risk. The truly difficult part was 13th Wang assassinating the left virtuous prince. Fan Xian didn't know how 13th Wang had killed the powerful left virtuous prince in the Endless Hu camp. He only knew that what he had promised him had been completed perfectly. He carried the unconscious 13th Wang back to the military yamen. With a silent expression, he began to treat this fierce warrior. Yiling handed him needles and knives behind him. Her face was full of shock and curiosity. She wondered who this Overwatch Council official who had been cut more than 30 times was. How would he survive like this? Chapter 610. For some reason, from the first time 13th Wang appeared on that snowy night, he had trusted Fan Xian greatly. Otherwise, he would not be sleeping like a baby in the room right now. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the unconscious young man on the bed and scratched his head. He couldn't find a suitable word to describe his current emotions. In the basin was a blood-soaked cloth. The bright red gave off a faint stench. In order to remove the leather jacket from 13th Wang's body, Fan Xian had expended a great deal of effort. The blood on the inside and outside of the jacket had long congealed and mixed with the wind and sand on the grasslands. Like glue, it stuck firmly to 13th Wang's body. He fed 13th Wang some medicine, pried open the already sealed wounds, squeezed out the pus inside, and restitched a number of wounds that had opened on the way here. After doing all this, Fan Xian was completely exhausted. Weakly, he sat on the side of the bed and stared at this man in a daze. Although he had taken the anesthetic and sunk into the deepest of unconsciousness, the pain in his body still made 13th Wang furrow his brows. This last disciple of the Dongyi Sword Hut had a delicate and pretty face, particularly his brows, which were furrowed particularly nicely. He was like a philosopher's statue, contemplating the problems of life. Fan Xian shook his head and threw the scissors and needles in his hands into the basin. He stretched. In the process of saving people, he had counted carefully. There were 38 wounds on 13th Wang's body. They were all knife wounds, and they were all concentrated in the front half of his torso. There were many stories in the military camp about how the wounds were all in the front of the body. 13th Wang used his bravery and valiance to perfectly prove these stories. He had faced countless knives alone and charged out head-on. Fan Xian stared at him in a daze. Although he hadn't personally seen 13th Wang assassinate the left virtuous prince or the scene of killing when he charged out of the continuous Hu camp, each of these wretched knife wounds seemed to tell of what had happened a dozen days ago on the grasslands. When was the last time he had a comrade covered in wounds? It should have been in Shangjing, in northern Qi. When he ripped open the young master's white robe, Fan Xian looked at 13th Wang on the bed and couldn't help but have the illusion that he and Yin Bingyun were the same person. However, 13th Wang's injuries were more serious than Yin Bingyun's. Furthermore, Fan Xian knew that the relationship between these two people and him was very different. Yin Bingyun was his subordinate and his arm, but he was also a loyal official of the Qin kingdom. 13th Wang had relied on him 2 years ago because of the interests of Dongyi. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the unconscious 13th Wang. He did not understand. Was something like a promise really so important to some people in this world? Even more important than his own life? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. The unconscious 13th Wang also furrowed his brows. Both of them were good-looking. However, 13th Wang was less stern than Fan Xian and more amiable. In his coma, there was a natural childishness. Both of them furrowed their brows at the same time. It was a wonderful sight. The sound of water being poured came from outside the room. Yiling filled a basin of hot water and walked back into the room. She wet a towel and then sat down on the side of the bed. Carefully, she helped 13th Wang wipe away the blood on his body. However, there were too many wounds on his body. She couldn't find a place to start for a long time. 38 cuts. Yiling bit her lower lip. It was as if she was feeling pain for this unknown Overwatch Council official. I don't know what you had him do in the grasslands for him to come back alive with such serious injuries. Earlier, when she was helping Fan Xian, Yiling was truly stunned. She was shocked by Fan Xian's superb medical skills. She was also shocked by the injuries of the person on the bed. Startled by Yiling's words, Fan Xian shook himself out of his thoughts. Pulling up the corners of his lips, he smiled helplessly. He is not an official of the Overwatch Council. Yiling glanced at him and didn't say anything. In reality, she had already guessed that the identity of the person lying on the bed was certainly not ordinary. Otherwise, Fan Xian would not have temporarily sealed off news of this person and had to trouble such a noble Wang Fei to personally help him. Fan Xian snatched the wet towel from her hand and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He is 13th Wang, a person from Dongyi. He is 13th Wang. Yiling's eyes immediately lit up. She sighed and said, "No wonder he is so brave." Fan Xian asked, "You've heard of him?" Yiling nodded and said, "Don't have the extravagant hope of being able to hide news of him. In less than 2 days, the Emperor will know that he has interfered on the grasslands. You should think carefully about how to explain it." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He wasn't afraid of explaining to the Emperor. In the end, which side Dongi would fall to, it was still Sigu Jianqian's words before his death. If he and 13th Wang improved their relationship, presumably the emperor would not be too angry. He was just curious as to why Yiling appeared to be so familiar with 13th Wang. Although not many people know that he was once your subordinate for more than half a year, many people in the military know that the Overwatch Council once had a powerful figure. Yiling seemed to have thought of something. Her expression dimmed. That year, there was a rebellion at Dong Mountain. The emperor was surrounded and trapped at the top of the mountain. Shang Shanhu led the Northern Expedition Army soldiers to attack the mountain and forced the imperial army to retreat step by step. If it weren't for 13th Wang bravely holding the pass, the mountain would probably have been broken through long ago. I heard that he later blocked a blow from Granduncle. Yiling shrugged. That day, this person left a deep impression on the imperial army. Everyone admired him greatly. After talking about him a lot these 2 years, he became famous. Yiling granduncle was the great Grandmaster Yi Luyun, who had disappeared without a trace after the Dong Mountain incident. Hearing these words, Fan Xian paused. He turned his head to glance at the unconscious 13th Wang and slowly said, "Given his brave and ferocious nature, if he was in the military, he would probably become a rarely seen fierce general." He didn't know that 2 years ago, the famous general of Northern Qi, Shang Shanhu, had such an evaluation of 13th Wang at the mountain gate. After a few days, 13th Wang woke up. No one knew what kind of power this young disciple of the Sword Hut had in his body for his injuries to heal quickly. On the day he woke up, Fan Xian suppressed the joy in his heart and asked straightforwardly, "You are the future of Dongi. What exactly are you planning by working so hard for me?" 13th Wang had left Dongi and returned to Fan Xian's side because of the promise in the snowy night, but it was not just because of this promise. He was silent for a moment. On his pale face, his brows, which were as thick as swords, appeared particularly frightening. After a long time, he slowly said, "Teacher can't hold on much longer." Fan Xian was silent. Sigu Jian's death was something everyone had expected. In everyone's hearts, this great Grandmaster of Dongi should have died 2 years ago. In the end, no one had thought that the most powerful idiot in the world would be able to drag on for 2 years until everyone was exhausted and embarrassed. It was to the point that everyone seemed to be hoping for his death. However, coming from 13th Wang's mouth, these words represented another meaning. Fan Xian knew that Sigu Jian did not have much time left. Dongi had to immediately decide what path it was going to take in the future. 13th Wang entering Shiliang Road this time and performing such a great service for Fan Xian was also Sigu Jian's arrangement. "Your teacher is a big idiot. I think it is very likely that you will inherit his legacy and become the second biggest idiot in the world." Fan Xian looked at 13th Wang's haggard face and coldly said, "You and Haitang are both orphans. Why throw away your head and spill your hot blood to protect such meaningless words?" 13th Wang smiled with some difficulty. He knew that while Fan Xian's words appeared mocking, they actually hid a glimmer of concern. He looked at Fan Xian and slowly said, "If it is not to protect something, then why are you here?" Fan Xian had nothing to say in response. 13th Wang finally said, "Teacher wants to see you one last time before he dies." Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. He immediately calmed down, furrowing his brows in thought for a moment. He then shook his head and said, "The emperor will not let me accept the Dongi matter." 13th Wang knew why he shook his head. Presently, Fan Xian was in charge of a Shiliang Road matter. If, in the future, even Dongi was taken into the arms of the Qing kingdom through his hands, it would make things difficult for the Qing emperor. In order to prevent an imbalance between ruler and officials, the Qing emperor would probably not let Fan Xian handle the Dongi matter. "Don't think of things too rosy." 13th Wang coughed. His newly healed wound almost burst open again. "The Sword Hut will open next spring. Teacher's intention is only to invite guests from various places to meet." Based on what 13th Wang said, Sigu Jian probably didn't have many days left to live. The opening of the sword hut in the spring of the 10th year of the Qing calendar was perhaps the last time this sword saint would show his brilliance in the world. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "Guests from various places?" "Yes," 13th Wang replied, "including guests from northern Qi." Fan Xian smiled. He knew what Siga Jian was thinking. After the great grandmaster passed, Dongyi would not be able to protect itself. It had to find a good tree to rest on. Asking him and the nobles from northern Qi to attend the ceremony was to see which of the two powers in the world offered a higher price and who had the most sincerity. Dongyi had long shown Fan Xian its sincerity. This sincerity was the sincerity 13th Wang's words had delivered on that snowy night 3 years ago. It was sincerity written in 13th Wang's blood. "If your teacher asks too much, I won't be able to help much," Fan Xian said seriously to 13th Wang. Very seriously, Fan Xian said to 13th Wang, "You know I'm speaking from the bottom of my heart. Never mind, rest well." After saying this, he realized that 13th Wang did not notice. Instead, his gaze had passed through the window and was cast toward a certain place in the courtyard. Fan Xian followed his gaze and saw Yiling in light yellow clothing. Yiling was sitting in the dusk. With a calm expression, she gazed at the lonely autumn trees outside the courtyard. She appeared particularly lonely. 13th Wang's gaze was very soft and lonely. Perhaps it was the wind, sand, and rain of blood on the grasslands that made this gentle but valiant man begin to appreciate the other side of life. Quietly, he said, "This girl is very lonely." "She is Yiling my disciple," Fan Xian said bitterly. "Her loneliness is a mistake made by me and all of her family." "Oh, right. During the days you were unconscious, it was she who looked after you." 13th Wang didn't turn his head. He only looked calmly at Yiling's silhouette in the distance. It was as if he was admiring a beautiful scene. Fan Xian suddenly remembered the first time he had met 13th Wang on that snowy night. He had used the name Tai Xiang and said he was going to Baiwa brothel to see all the beauties in the Qing kingdom. Involuntarily, a glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of his lips. He thought of some phrases and people. "You looked calmly out the window, and I looked at you silently. The curtain held both of us, savoring the gentle loneliness." Fan Xian slowly rubbed the string of beads on his wrist. It was as if he had returned to the grasslands with Haitang gently leaning against his arm. It was impossible for Haitang to suddenly appear by his side. This reality made Fan Xian feel disappointed. Although he and Yin Bingyan had used 4 months and relied on the shadow and 13th Wang's extraordinary strength to perfectly complete the Overwatch Council's plan, when he thought of Haitang still on the grasslands and the possibility that she would forever remain in the autumn grass and blue sea, Fan Xian felt anger for no reason. This anger was mostly directed at Ku He's arrangements before his death and his hatred for the little emperor of northern Qi. Of course, the present northern Qi emperor was no longer small. Although the connection between the palace treasury and the north had been greatly weakened because of the Qing emperor's powerful intimidation, the northern Qi emperor had quickly consolidated the court and fully demonstrated his ability to govern. Under the Qing kingdom's overbearing aura, he did not show any signs of defeat. On the contrary, he began to stretch out his hands and legs, intending to counterattack. For example, in Shiliang Road, Fan Xian had spent a great deal of money to move Deng Ziyu back from northern Qi's Shangjing to target northern Qi's infiltration of Shiliang Road. Following the deaths of the northern Qi people in the court, the Overwatch Council's purge operation in Dingzhou and Qingzhou began with a bang. Because the Overwatch Council had prepared for a long time, and the person in charge of this matter was Deng Ziyu, who knew the way the northern Qi brocade guard did things, it proceeded particularly smoothly. With the full cooperation of the General's Manor and the Governor's Manor of Shiliang Road, the Overwatch Council only used 10 days to capture over 40 northern Qi spies in Dingzhou and Qingzhou. The number of northern Qi spies who had died to the hands of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had already surpassed 100. In order to destroy northern Qi's infiltration of Shiliang, Fan Xian had spent a great deal of money and exposed a few officials who had developed in the Northern Chi Court for many years to obtain the name list. He knew that although the Hu people on the grasslands appeared to be able to resist at the moment, if they were allowed to continue developing, they would become a great threat to the Qing kingdom. Thus, he did not care about anything. He had to kill the signs of the Hu people's prosperity before the spring dew fell. He also knew that each time the Overwatch Council captured a Northern Qi spy in Shiliang Road and killed a spy, the distance between him and Haidang would increase. Furthermore, there were still a few Tianyi Dao disciples lying in ambush in Shiliang Road. The death of the left virtuous prince of Shi who brought too many unstable factors to the grasslands. The hardliners, led by the foremost ace of the king's tent, Hu Gu, demanded that the chief of the court give an explanation for this matter. Without being conferred a title by the court, the left virtuous prince's tribe had elected the left virtuous prince's youngest son as the new left virtuous prince. At the same time, they raised a knife of revenge against the various powers on the grasslands. The biggest suspects for the left virtuous prince's death were, of course, the chief of the court and the right virtuous prince. Although the court had once said that the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council had secretly done this, not many people believed it. Furthermore, Hu Gu was still picking fights internally. In order to stabilize the situation on the grasslands, Chief Su Bida was forced to acknowledge the new left virtuous prince's position. He sent envoys to pacify them and guarantee that they would give the left virtuous prince's subordinates a satisfactory explanation. What was a satisfactory explanation? It was the head of the murderer and the massacre of the murderer's tribe. The problem was that the murderer had long escaped. No one knew which tribe he was from. Thus, the grasslands were in turmoil. At any moment, there was the possibility of a big battle breaking out. Additionally, the court had, in a short half a month, suddenly lost all of their spies in Shiliang Road and became blind. For a moment, they were unable to respond. There were many troubles on the grasslands. However, these troubles needed Chief Su Bida and Haitang to resolve. As for Fan Xian, who had created these troubles, he was not unhappy at all. He just watched everything that happened on the grasslands with cold eyes from Qingzhou. According to his agreement with Hu Gu would completely lean toward the chief of the court next spring. After all, given Hu Ji's current strength, even if he had the full support of the left virtuous prince's subordinates, he would not be able to overthrow the position of the chief of the court. Since it was so, it was better to change sides. Presumably, Chief Su Bida would happily welcome the arrival of the power that Hu Gu belonged to. With the chief's support, in addition to the Qing Kingdom's secret support, presumably, it wouldn't be long before Hu Ji's tribe would develop and grow. At that time, Chief Su Bida would truly have a headache. The grasslands would welcome a truly difficult time. Concerning this matter, Fan Xian had only made the beginning. He dug 2 shovels and threw down a seed. He then waited for the seed to germinate, grow, and take over the place where the grass grew. It had to be admitted that his 2 shovels, particularly the 1/13th Wang had swung down, had truly taken the lives of the Hu people. Fan Xian stayed in Qingzhou, not just to watch the show on the grasslands. He also wanted to watch the show playing out in Qingzhou. However, before he could finish watching the show in Qingzhou, he received a secret report from Jingdou. This secret report from Baiyue Brothel regarding the Great Prince made him angry. Faintly, he sighed. The affairs of the world are difficult to predict. The affairs of the world are difficult to predict. The title of the chapter was a song by Do Wei. As for the monthly votes, I have already closed in to within 200 votes. It has been hard on everyone. It has been hard on me. Let's work hard together. Please continue to give me monthly votes. Chapter 611. Presently, Baiyue Brothel had spread a large net throughout the world. Although all the powers knew that the largest brothel alliance in the world was the property of the Fan family, they had no way of controlling it. After all, this was proper business. Regardless of which country's laws, they could not control it. Baiyue Brothel's conditions were good. They were polite and considerate to the girls in the building. The guests were truly happy, and labor and management were harmonious. Furthermore, they had Fan Xian's power as a backer and Xiao Mingji and Zhaoshang Money House as financial support. In a short 4 years, they had spread their tentacles to every place. Although Baoyue Brothel's intelligence gathering was not as professional or powerful as the Overwatch Council's, at least it provided Fan Xian with another source of information. In the end, the Overwatch Council was the official spy organization of the Qin Kingdom. There was always a faint fear in Fan Xian's heart. If one day the Emperor had him hand over the Overwatch Council, then his eyesight and hearing would both decline greatly. For example, this secret report regarding the Great Prince proved the benefits of Fan Xian's strong support for Baoyue Brothel. As for the information in the secret report, the Overwatch Council's report, and even the Qinian unit's secret report, did not mention a single word. If Baoyue Brothel had not leaked it out, Fan Xian would not have known that another good show was about to play out in Jingdou. Of course, Fan Xian knew that this matter could not be blamed on the Overwatch Council and the Qinian unit. After all, it involved the face of the royal family and the emperor's family matters. Even if the official spy organization had found some information, before it could be confirmed and with the internal court and imperial censorate watching, they could not report it to him without evidence. Baoyue Brothel did not care about this. In the organization structure under Fan Xian's control, Baoyue Brothel was more like the imperial censorate. It had the freedom to hear rumors and discuss official matters. The secret report mentioned the Great Prince taking on a secondary fae. It was just a rumor that occasionally spread through Jingdou. Wind from an empty cave was not without reason. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and thought about what had happened in Jingdou. If it was just the eldest prince taking on a secondary wife, it would have been a small matter. There was no need for him to be so nervous. But the key point was that the Baoyue House's report made it very clear that the selection of a secondary wife was completely decided by the palace. The eldest prince did not know about this beforehand, and it was rumored that the eldest prince was very conflicted about this matter. He had already entered the palace and argued with the king twice. Fan Xian's head hurt. He knew what kind of person his elder brother was. Although the Great Prince understood the big picture, when it came to family matters involving the root of the family, he was very stubborn. Additionally, his relationship with the Great Wang Fei was harmonious. How could he agree to another marriage in the palace? For the palace to want him to take another secondary fei, there was clearly a deeper level of consideration. Regarding this, Fan Xian knew very well. Ever since the Jingdou rebellion had truly been quelled and the emperor had once again found his love for his eldest son, the first thing he did was not move the Great Prince to the border army as a commander with real power. Instead, he secretly prepared for the Great Prince to take on a secondary fei. Thus, the matter of taking on a secondary fei had actually been carried out in secret for a long time. However, it had been forcefully resisted by the Great Prince and had not truly surfaced. The Great Wang Fei was the Great Princess of Northern Qi. The honeymoon period between the Qin Kingdom and Northern Qi had already ended. For the sake of future battles, the emperor would not allow his eldest son to be controlled by a Northern Qi woman. In the final Northern expedition, the Great Prince was clearly the best choice for the vanguard commander. The emperor's intentions were clear. He would first have him take on a secondary fei. Then, he would find an opportunity and an excuse to depose the Great Wang Fei. The meaning was clear. It was a pity that the Qing emperor's sons were disobedient. The Great Prince had never been such an obedient person, which was why he had been able to resist for 2 years. However, from a news from the Baoyue House, it seemed that the palace was preparing to bring this matter to light and directly make the decision. Fan Xian hugged his knees with a headache. He was very angry. He had a strong opinion of the Great Prince. He thought to himself, since the emperor is forcing him so fiercely, what are you afraid of if you agree for now? Delay it as long as you can. Do you really have to wait for the emperor to give an edict and then have you go to the palace and play a game of refusing to submit? How could a member of the royal family have the right to be a saint of love? However, the Great Prince and the Great Wang Fei, this married couple, had a sense of a long-lasting relationship. It made Fan Xian feel great admiration and sigh at his own inferiority. other than admiration. What made Fan Xian's head hurt was that the intelligence report from Baoyu House was vague, but secretly revealed a piece of information. After the Emperor and Lady Ning discussed it, they temporarily suppressed their anger and prepared to have Fan Xian return to the capital to persuade the Great Prince to take on a secondary fey. It had to be said that after the Jingdo rebellion and the deaths of the Crown Prince and Second Prince, the Qing Emperor's attitude toward his remaining 3 sons was much warmer than before. If it had been in the past, the Great Prince would probably have long been imprisoned in his manor if he dared to forcefully resist an edict. It was not like now, where he could resist his temper and let Fan Xian go persuade him. The Emperor's secret edict would probably take some time before it reached Fan Xian's ears. Baoyu House received the news much faster. Fan Xian held his head and thought, what exactly is going on? When the Great Princess of Northern Qi had traveled thousands of li south to marry the Great Prince, he had been the one to officiate the wedding. Was he going to be the one to break off the marriage after 4 years? Just as he had sighed earlier, the affairs of the world were truly hard to predict. It was morning. The sunlight from the east shone through the lonely autumn trees in the Qingzhou military yamen and cut into a few large patches of light, illuminating the paper windows in the room. A serving girl carried a plate and passed by the window, casting a shadow on the window. The shadow stood quietly by Fan Xian's side and looked at his worried face without saying a word. The best assassin in the world was used to standing quietly behind Chen Pingping or Fan Xian, blending into the shadows of the building or scenery. He was used to seeing the constant worry of the last masters of the Overwatch Council, but he was still not used to talking to them and giving them advice. His mission was to kill people and did not include these pitiful things that used his brain. After returning from the grasslands, the shadow took off his herdsman's clothes and returned to Fan Xian's side. Just like in the past few years, he was very quiet. However, Fan Xian occasionally noticed that the best assassin in the world would occasionally glance at 13th Wang, who was resting in the courtyard. His gaze was complicated and strange. I cannot return to the capital right now. Fan Xian knew that the shadow was not Yin Bingyun, Deng Ziyu, or the chatterbox Wang Qinian. Waiting for him to speak was an impossible matter. He rubbed the space between his brows and said, First, the Shiliang Road matter has not ended. Second, since there is no news from the capital, it is not appropriate for me to rush back like this. This is only a small matter. The shadow knew that Commissioner Fan wanted to talk to him. He paused for a moment and then said, Don't worry too much. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. It is not a small matter. You don't know how stubborn the men of the Li family are. Take Cheng Xian and the Second Prince, for example. They would rather die stubbornly than lower their heads to the Emperor. Although the Great Prince's personality is much more open-minded, in his bones, he has the taste of Dongi people's desire for freedom. With the Emperor pressuring him like this, who knows what kind of frightening response he will make. Not waiting for the shadow to open his mouth to reply, Fan Xian's face was full of melancholy. He continued, The Emperor, and perhaps everyone in court, seems to firmly believe one thing. Those who are not of our race must have different intentions. Otherwise, why would no one believe that the Great Prince will inherit the throne just because he is half Dongi? He is half Dongi, and his Wang Fei is a Northern Qi person. In the current situation, the Emperor wanting him to depose of his concubine actually has the intention of protecting him and placing him in an important position. In the Jingdo Rebellion, there were 3 people who had performed meritorious deeds. They were Fan Xian, Yi Zhong, and the Great Prince. At the time, the Great Prince held the imperial army in his hands and controlled the vital points. However, he resolutely carried out the Emperor's so-called posthumous edict and successfully controlled the situation of the rebellion to a level that the Qing kingdom could accept. Because of this matter, the Emperor's attitude toward him had changed greatly. It was no longer as cold as it had been in the past. Accurately speaking, the Emperor feels some guilt toward the Great Prince, Fan Xian said quietly as he rubbed the spot between his brows. As Fan Xian rubbed his aching brows, he quietly said, So he wants to make it up to the Great Prince. Given the Great Prince's lifelong ambition, the best way to make it up to him is to be the vanguard and fight for the Qing kingdom from the south to the north, unify the world, and shine on the battlefield. The emperor has truly decided to use him as commander, which is why he has to depose the great Wang Fei. Thinking of this, he also felt some resentment toward the emperor. The great Wang Fei was the great princess of northern Qi. It did indeed affect the great prince's decision to be the commander of the northern expedition. But why did he have to use such unconventional methods as taking a secondary Fei to resolve it? This was not the demeanor a ruler of a country should have. It was more like an old man who was angry with his son. Suddenly his heart jumped. Did the emperor still not learn from his past experiences and still maintain a powerful suspicion? Is he using all kinds of methods to eliminate these suspicions in the bud? Fan Xian's heart gradually grew cold. He realized that he had made a mistake these years. He had still underestimated the emperor's powerful desire for power and the emperor's natural paranoia and coldness. It was difficult to be a son. It was even more difficult to be the son of the emperor. It was even more difficult to be the son of the Qing emperor. Fan Xian let out a shaky breath. He knew that after he returned to the capital, he would probably be stuck between the emperor and the great prince. It was better not to think about this problem for now, but he was a little curious. He didn't know whose daughter the emperor had appointed to the great prince's side concubine was, and which noble or minister was so unafraid of death that they dared to send their daughter into the mouths of the tigress great Wang Fei, the great prince, the male tigress, and the old tigress concubine Ning. After the Jingdo rebellion, the emperor remembered Lady Ning's merits and took into account the great prince's face. After a delay of more than 20 years, he finally made her an imperial consort. However, after this Dongyi female slave became an imperial consort, she still did not change her past shrewish personality. She was still full of tiger nature. The great prince's family was a tiger forest. In any case, it could not be Ruo. Fan Xian was confident of this. Presently, the emperor trusted and favored him greatly. He also knew that for the sake of Ruo's marriage, he had not hesitated to beat Hongsheng into a lewd person. Naturally, he would not use this to seduce him and lose the big for the small. Fan Xian stood and pushed open the door. He welcomed the courtyard filled with the colors of autumn and no longer thought about the troubles in Jingdo. It was already late autumn. As far as the eye could see, the military yamen was filled with a clean and distant color. The sky was very high, and the clouds were very light. It made one feel a sense of open-mindedness at a glance. The city of Qingzhou was close to Shihu and had the air of the grasslands. Perhaps only in this kind of place could people cultivate a cheerful and beautiful mood, such as the unusual great prince of the royal family, or the unusual Yiling of the nobility. Fan Xian smiled slightly as he gazed at the girls in the courtyard. He thought to himself that the great Wang Fei's present situation was very difficult, but the second Wang Fei seemed to have gradually shaken off the shadow of the second prince's death. There were always some good things that happened in the world. 13th Wang's body recovered quickly. He was now able to wander around the Qingzhou military yamen in a wheelchair. Because of Yiling Er's words, Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to do any more useless concealment. He called for a few girls to be responsible for pushing the cart and sent a few subordinates of the 6th Bureau to follow him and protect his safety. During these dozen days, Fan Xian had been busy communicating with Ding Zhou and leading the counterattack in Shilyang Road. He also had to carry out private transactions with the grasslands. He was very busy and didn't pay much attention to 13th Wang's movements. However, he was not blind. He could see that this lonely and desolate Qingzhou military yamen had gradually changed because of 13th Wang's awakening. Occasionally, a hint of spring seeped through the autumn garden. When 13th Wang sat in his wheelchair and occasionally rested in the garden, not far from him, a girl would be sitting and doing other things, such as embroidery or playing dumb and looking at the scenery. At that time, 13th Wang would become a dumb goose and stare in a daze at the dumb goose looking at the scenery. Other than greeting each other when they bumped into each other, this young man and woman did not say any idle words. They just foolishly played out their roles. They wanted to sing to the sky, but were also afraid that their red palms would lightly tug and disturb the unfocused clear waves. Fan Xian was the little ancestor of the Overwatch Council, and Yi Ling was the little ancestor of Qingzhou. After she gave the order, they no longer went out of the city every day to intercept the Hu people galloping out of the grasslands to gather grain like they had in the past year. Instead, they stayed obediently in the military yamen. The old subordinates in the military yamen were all chased out, leaving only the servants and serving girls. Thus, there was now an additional scenery in the Qingzhou military yamen's little garden. It was the appearance of the two dumb geese that Fan Xian was secretly laughing at his heart. If one were to use a more beautiful phrase, it would be the scenery, the people in the scenery, and the people looking at the scenery. For two people who admired each other, each was the other's scenery, right? As her teacher, Fan Xian knew what kind of woman Yi Ling was. Sometimes, when he asked himself honestly if he was a woman, he would probably also be shaken to the core by the 38 knife marks on 13th Wang's front. Furthermore, 13th Wang was a silent, gentle, and handsome person. How could such a person not move Yi Ling, who had been born in the military? Although Yi Ling's identity was somewhat troublesome, Fan Xian was not worried about it. 2 years ago, the emperor had secretly given a gracious edict allowing Yi Ling to remarry and choose her own husband. This was a great grace. As long as she liked someone, the Qing court would probably snatch him for her, even if it meant fighting for him. The problem now was 13th Wang's identity. Although he secretly worked for the Overwatch Council, and the emperor also secretly knew of this matter, he was, after all, Sigu Jian's last disciple and the 13th disciple of Dong Yi's sword hut. Yi Ling had once been the second Wang Fei, yet she was going to marry an ace from Dong Yi. No one knew if she would be able to get past the palace. Of course, if Dong Yi could completely lean toward the Qing kingdom under his leadership, then these obstacles would not exist. Fan Xian decided to put some effort into this matter. It could be considered making it up to this pitiful girl on behalf of the emperor and Yi Zhong. There was only one problem. Fan Xian looked at the two people in the garden with amusement. Rubbing his nose, he thought that these two people were still in a strange state. Someone had to expose them. Most importantly, it was not strange that Yi Ling liked 13th Wang. What exactly was 13th Wang thinking? No matter how noble Yi Ling's identity was, she was, after all, a true widow. He knew why 13th Wang was attracted to Yi Ling's profile. It was very lonely. Fan Xian knew that the real Yi Ling was not like this, particularly embroidery. Fan Xian shivered. Yi Ling had actually embroidered in front of 13th Wang and pretended to be delicate and timid. If this matter got back to Jingdou and reached Wan's ears, his wife would probably faint from laughter. He decided to tell 13th Wang the real Yi Ling, so that his young friend, whom he admired greatly, would not find out after marriage that his life was a major misunderstanding. Just as Fan Xian was walking down the stone steps and preparing to disturb the supercilious young man and woman, the shadow behind the door quietly said something. He immediately stopped his steps. These days, the shadow had carefully hidden his tracks to prevent 13th Wang from discovering anything. Fan Xian knew the complicated relationship between the shadow and the sword hut. He also knew the shadow's true identity could not be known by anyone. Sigu Jian and the shadow had an irreconcilable hatred. Looking at Sigu Jian's favorite disciple in the autumn garden, the shadow's mood was not as happy as the man and woman in the garden. A moment later, Fan Xian said, "We'll go next spring. He won't die so early." Chapter 612. As for Sigu Jian's life and death, the shadow was more concerned than anyone else. He did not want Sigu Jian to die to someone else's hands, even if it was the merciless hands of heaven. Many years ago, Dong Yi had suddenly fallen into chaos. Sigu Jian had gone mad with his sword and slaughtered all the elders and relatives of his clan. Only the 16-year-old shadow had escaped. From the age of 16, the shadow's life had continued with the thought of revenge against his elder brother. He gradually sank in powerful fear and anger and became the shadow behind the two leaders of the Overwatch Council. The reason Siga Jian was called an idiot was probably because his methods when he slaughtered his own clan were too bloody and crazy. As for how the shadow escaped Dongi, met Chen Pingping, and was accepted into the Overwatch Council by Chen Pingping, became loyal, and fought to the death, that was perhaps another long story. Fan Xian was not very clear on this point and didn't want to ask too closely. Everyone beside him had their own stories and their own secrets, such as Jinggu, the Yin family, and the Shadow. However, he knew the identity the Shadow hid in the deepest part and the blood feud between him and Siga Jian. Just like how he treated the other people beside him, Fan Xian and them helped each other and supported each other as they walked through these difficult times. Fan Xian didn't turn his head. In a quiet voice, he said, "I know you've always wanted to ask him something. Don't worry, you will definitely be able to ask." The Shadow was silent for a moment and then disappeared behind Fan Xian. He did not let 13th Wang and Yi Ling in the garden detect a trace. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then walked toward the garden. In a moment, he had arrived between the silent man and woman. 13th Wang raised his head and glanced at him, feeling slightly surprised. The Qing court was currently in Shiliang Road, fighting the Hoot people of the grasslands and northern Xi's reinforcements. For a dozen consecutive days, Fan Xian had been extremely busy because of this matter. Why did he have the leisure to come out to the garden now? Yilinger had her head bowed as she worked on her taut embroidery frame. She had long since sensed Fan Xian's arrival and immediately jumped out of the quiet, peaceful, and happy atmosphere she had been in. Her heart was filled with hidden bitterness, and the already slow speed of her needles became even slower. It didn't seem like she was embroidering, but more like she was using the tip of a thin needle to tickle the taut fabric. Fan Xian stood between the two of them. Since they did not speak, he could not find any reason to speak. With his hands behind his back, he put on an expression as if he knew everything. Gazing at the lonely autumn trees outside the garden, he pretended to be elegant. Seeing him act so pretentiously, 13th Wang didn't know if Fan Xian had seen through the thoughts he had never expressed. His gaze became slightly chaotic. Yilinger glanced at him, lowered her head, and gently bit her lower lip. The time had come. Fan Xian coughed and said, "Wang Fei, although the scenery in Qingzhou is not bad, you embroider in the garden every day. With the garden walls blocking your vision, it is impossible to see clearly, right?" Hearing the words Wang Fei, Yilinger thought Fan Xian was reminding her of something. Her face immediately paled, and she didn't reply. 13th Wang was silent. Like Yilinger, he had also misunderstood Fan Xian's meaning. He thought to himself that although he had not spoken much with the young lady of the Yi family, he knew she was a woman with a refreshing personality. There was indeed a chord in his heart that had been tugged at by the wind in Qingzhou. However, she was, after all, the Qing Wang Fei. The difference in status was too great. Fan Xian sighed and turned his head to 13th Wang. 13th, although you are heavily injured and need someone to take care of you. After all, men and women have to be careful, particularly since the young lady of the Yi family is the Qing kingdom's Wang Fei. There is no one else in the garden watching. You two just sit facing each other like this. You have to think about how I will explain this to the palace when I return to the capital. These words made things clear. 13th Wang had been sighing earlier, but under the gentleness of his personality, there was an incomparable stubbornness. Raising his brows, he looked at Fan Xian and said, "I'll leave the manor immediately." Yilinger raised her head in shock and glared fiercely at Fan Xian. Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. Shortly after, he smiled warmly and thought to himself that this was a 13th Wang worthy of his trust. Ignoring Yilinger's angry glare beside him, he flipped his palm and drew 3 circles in the air. He then grabbed at the embroidery cloth in front of Yiling. It was gentle and windless, but was also very fast. It was the little trick he had relied on to become famous. Yilinger's fingertips unconsciously tightened. The embroidery needle carried the sound of the wind as it pierced toward Fan Xian's wrist at a tricky angle. This was also a little trick. However, these tricks had been taught to her by Fan Xian. So how could she stop Fan Xian from stealing the cloth? With a flash of a figure, Fan Xian had already taken the embroidery cloth from her hands and floated to 13th Wang's side. With a smile, he said, 13th, I was just afraid you'd be tricked. Our Wang Fei is not a young lady of a large family who knows how to embroider. 13th Wang was slightly startled. He didn't understand why the commissioner would suddenly say this. Immediately after, he saw Fan Xian place the embroidery cloth in front of his eyes. Embroidered on the cloth was half a water duck. Yi Ling'er had been in the garden, where 13th Wang could see, embroidered for a whole 7 days. In the end, she had only embroidered half a water duck. 13th Wang immediately understood what Fan Xian meant by misunderstanding and couldn't resist smiling slightly. It was Fan Xian who laughed loudly and said, the pleasure between a man and a woman is a matter of course. No one could stop you. However, you have to think carefully. Yi Ling'er abruptly rose. She was so angry that her entire body trembled. She looked angrily at Fan Xian, but she was too embarrassed to say anything. Mist gradually rose in her eyes. She appeared very pitiful. 13th Wang looked at this woman's appearance and felt an inexplicable pain in his heart. He withdrew his smile, and his face was full of concern. Fan Xian slowly stopped laughing. Suddenly, he lowered his voice and said by 13th Wang's ear, you have to talk about love. Even if these two dumb geese were to sit together for a lifetime, what use would it be? 13th Wang knew that this person had come specially to help him break through the layer of paper on the window. Other than feeling slightly embarrassed, he couldn't help feeling grateful. However, he was unable to speak as shamelessly as Fan Xian. Yi Ling'er didn't know what Fan Xian had said. Looking at the two of them whispering to each other, she felt very uneasy. Fan Xian had finished what he needed to do and leisurely walked toward the front yard of the military yamen. His posture was relaxed, as if he had done something very good and was very pleased with himself. Yi Ling'er looked at his retreating figure. For some reason, a great dissatisfaction rose in her heart. She huffed lightly and mockingly said, Teacher, I don't know how to embroider, but this water duck, I'm afraid it's better than the one in your house. Hearing these words, Fan Xian immediately thought of the needle marks on Wan'er's fingers, as well as the water duck painting. A chill ran through his body, and his face was filled with embarrassment. How could he reply? He quickly fled into the wilderness. Looking at this scene, Yi Ling'er giggled. Her laughter echoed like silver bells in the autumn garden in Qingzhou. However, the person beside her did not laugh. He only looked at her quietly and appreciatively. It was boring to laugh alone. Yi Ling'er awkwardly stopped laughing. During the dozen days 13th Wang had been recovering, she had indeed restrained her free and arrogant nature. She appeared particularly peaceful. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had still managed to break through. She didn't know if this scene fell into the man's eyes or if he would feel that she was too bitter. Countless thoughts immediately flashed through her mind. The emotions in her eyes were incomparably complicated. 13th Wang was actually a bit nervous, but he hid it well on his face. Looking at Yi Ling'er, he said, I am Wang Shi, formerly known as Tai Xiong. I am the 13th disciple of Dongyi's sword hut. Thank you for your care these days. I cannot thank you enough. Yi Ling'er had not thought that he would suddenly speak and speak so seriously. Her heart was a little flustered. She calmed herself and returned the greeting. Lightly, she said, Sir Wang is too polite. In Yi Ling'er's opinion, it was much more relaxed and natural to use an official's title to refer to him. She did not understand. They had already known each other for a dozen days and had only exchanged a dozen sentences. Why did he have to express his thanks so seriously now? Was he truly prepared to leave the manor, or was all of this just a dream? Yi Ling'er sighed faintly in her heart. If it had been another woman, perhaps she would have chosen to leave because of this sense of serenity. However, Yi Ling'er was, after all, Yi Ling'er. She did not know how to embroider. She only knew how to wield knives and spears. Although she was a widow, she was still like she was when she was a teenager, wild and full of vigor. She stared closely into 13th Wang's eyes and said, "If you have something to say, just say it. There is no need to introduce yourself. Looking at the way you do things, you are also a straightforward person. Don't be as long-winded and hypocritical as Fan Xian." 13th Wang paused slightly. A moment later, he said seriously, "Sir Fan Jr. said that everything can be discussed." Yi Linger understood some of the meaning. Suddenly, she felt a gust of autumn wind blow past. When it brushed against her face, there was not a trace of harshness. There was only 100 degrees of gentleness. The matter between 13th Wang and Yi Linger was not as Fan Xian had imagined. After his provocation, they met in the golden wind and jade dew. It was better than countless things in the mortal world. When dry wood and fierce fire met, it was like the yellow river overflowing and could not be stopped. On the contrary to his expectations, this young man and woman still maintained their politeness and sat across the stone path. They would only occasionally say a few words. Speaking of which, it was strange. 13th Wang and Yi Linger's personalities were both first-rate, particularly Yi Linger, who had grown up on the edge of the grasslands. Compared to the young ladies in Jingdo, she was much more cheerful. However, once love was involved, because of the tragedy in Jingdo 2 years ago, as well as 13th Wang's identity, both of them were somewhat silent. Seeing all of this, Fan Xian was not in a rush. In any case, there were always thousands of things in the world. It was impossible to ask all men and women in love to be like him, impatient to climb walls and jump through windows. Furthermore, he didn't have time to pay attention to these beautiful things. He still needed to take the lead in dealing with the not-so-beautiful things in Shiliang Road. Time quickly came to the end of autumn and the beginning of winter. The 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council gathered in Dingzhou. The 8 tribes on the grasslands gathered in the court to discuss matters. With unusual ruthlessness, the Qin kingdom cut off the hand that the grasslands had extended, as well as the hand that northern Qi had extended toward the grasslands. They watched with cold eyes as the situation on the grasslands became more and more unbearable by the day. The hand that Master Ku he had set up on the grasslands before he died, and the hand that the northern Qi emperor had crossed the North Sea, the desert, and the Qin kingdom's border in over a year gently clasped at the border between Shiliang Road and the grasslands. After holding it for almost a year, it had put the Qin court to the test. The borders were unusually tight. The national treasury, military power, and spirit were all forced to stay in the west, slowing the pressure on their true enemy, Northern Qi. Under the emperor's leadership, the Overwatch Council used 4 months to prepare. Fan Xian personally led the team. Finally, in the late autumn and cold winter of the 9th year of the Qin calendar, they cut off these 2 hands that held each other. Perhaps the situation on the grasslands, under the control of Chief Su Bida and Haitang, would not deteriorate to an unmanageable level. However, it would not be so easy for the Northern Qi Emperor to cause trouble in Shiliang Road. Furthermore, Fan Xian had also set up his own power on the grasslands. When the flowers bloomed next spring, he would begin to reap the fruits. After confirming the implementation of the various arrangements and verifying the results of the battle, Fan Xian finally freed himself from the extremely busy council affairs and began to prepare to return to the capital. 13th Wang would not follow him back to the capital. Firstly, his injuries had not healed. Secondly, Fan Xian did not want him to have too much contact with the shadow along the way. Thirdly, Yi Linger's return to the capital for the new year was still half a month later. It was always good for the two of them to spend more time together. Once Fan Xian had decided on something, he rarely changed it. Since he had decided to help Yi Linger and 13th Wang be together, he had his own confidence. After returning to the capital and taking care of the great prince's family matters, he would probably have to go to the Bureau of Military Affairs to propose marriage to General Yi. Of course, this matter first required the emperor's approval. On the 15th day of the winter of the 9th year of the Qin calendar, the Overwatch Council finished their operation in Shiliang Road. The Commissioner Fan Xian passed through Dingzhou and stepped on the road back to the capital. Outside Dingzhou, there were countless officials and generals who had come to see him off. They lined up densely in 2 rows. The governor of Shiliang Road and General Li Hongchang stood side by side with Fan Xian. After saying a few official words, they ended the conversation. At the end, Li Hongchang gazed deeply at Fan Xian. Fan Xian knew what he meant and did not reply. He only quietly said, "I'll wait for you in Jingdou." The group of carriages set off and drove onto the official road in front of Dingzhou. Fan Xian unconsciously turned his head back to look. He did not stop his gaze on the Dingzhou military and political officials. Instead, he raised his head and looked at the row of wooden frames on the Dingzhou city gates. An entire row of wooden frames was nailed to the top of the Dingzhou city gates. On each frame hung a corpse. In this operation, they had executed over 40 spies. After these spies died, they still could not find a place to rest. They were hung high above the city gates and allowed the autumn wind to blow and the autumn sun to shine. Some of the corpses that had been hung the earliest had almost completely rotted. Even the evil birds in the fields were unwilling to peck at them, revealing the white bones that could faintly be seen below. The clothes on the corpses were in tatters and carried the black bloodstains of torture. A long row of corpses swayed slowly in the wind above the city gate. It gave off a terrifying and bloody stench, and it welcomed all the people who came from the Chinese plains. This terrifying scene served as a warning to all the people in the world. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and pulled his head back from the window. Hanging corpses had its own effect in psychological warfare. At least, the spies the Northern Qi Emperor would send in the future would at least have an innate sense of fear. However, in the battles of the Central Plain, due to the balance of morality and benevolence that had existed for thousands of years, the killing of prisoners of war was rare. As for humiliating corpses, it had never been seen before. Dingzhou was not the Central Plain. This was an important place in the battle between the Central Plain and Shihu. The two sides had fought for thousands of years and had done even crueler things. Fan Xian did not have much sympathy for the spies. What he had seen along the way from Dingzhou to Qingzhou had made him understand that once the war began, particularly the lingering hatred between nations, it could not be resolved by benevolence and morality. Just the dozens of corpses hanging above the city gates had caused the Qing kingdom to pay with the deaths of thousands of commoners. What made Fan Xian even colder was that these people were not Hu people. They were Northern Qi people of the same origin and ancestry as the people of the Qing kingdom. As for the hatred between the grasslands and the Central Plain, his generation did not have the ability to resolve it peacefully, so he would leave it to the more intelligent descendants. Fan Xian closed his eyes and rested. He thought to himself that he had severed the hand that held Northern Qi and the grasslands. At the very least, he had severely wounded them. He had probably also cut a wretched wound between him and Haidang. He didn't know if this wound would heal in the future. He didn't know what Haidang would do on the grasslands. This grassland, this grand city, that border, would he ever come again in this life? As he thought these gloomy thoughts, the Imperial Envoy's carriage had already arrived at the closest relay station outside Dingzhou. It was the place where Fan Xian had peeped at the erotic palace. Entering the relay station, Fan Xian teased the deputy he was familiar with. However, the deputy, who had been released from prison with great difficulty, did not dare to respond loudly. He obediently went to boil water. Fan Xian looked at Deng Ziyu beside him and said, "Ziyu, I'll need you to endure in Shiliang Road for another 2 years." All 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council had sent important officials to Dingzhou to supervise the battle. Deng Ziyu had been summoned back from the distant Northern Qi by Fan Xian. Now that Fan Xian had left, the matters of Shiliang Road were all handed over to Deng Ziyu. The officials saw the Imperial envoy out of the city and returned, but the officials of the Overwatch Council saw them all the way to the relay station. Deng Ziyu nodded and said, "I'll listen to your arrangements." Fan Xian thought for a moment and gave him some instructions. He then began to read the court bulletins from Jingdou. A moment later, his eyes narrowed slightly. As the second person in charge of the Qinian unit, Deng Ziyu had served Sir Fan Jr. for a long time. Seeing him narrow his eyes, he knew something troublesome had happened. Fan Xian smiled and said, "It was mentioned in the council bulletins. The court bulletins have finally confirmed that the commander of the imperial army in the palace has changed." Deng Ziyu's heart jumped. He thought to himself, the great prince has always been safe in leading the imperial army. Why would there suddenly be a change? Chapter 613. The court bulletin and council report stated clearly that the position of commander of the Jingdo imperial army was no longer held by the great prince. It had been given to Gong Dian. After Gong Dian had quelled the rebellion in Jingdo, he had once again taken up his old position as commander of the palace guards. It was not strange that he was now also the commander of the imperial army. Everyone knew of the Yi family's loyalty to the emperor. The royal palace was no longer the responsibility of the great prince's safety, so it could only be given to Gong Dian. The problem now was, after the great prince was no longer the commander of the imperial army, what position would the emperor place him in? The court bulletin did not say, and there were no clear rumors in Jingdo. Fan Xian looked at the paper in his hand and couldn't help but shake his head. A few important appointments had been made in Jingdo. These appointments were all concentrated in the military. It was clear that the emperor had some thoughts. Furthermore, he was beginning to open up a position for the great prince. What caught Fan Xian's attention the most was that the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Xiao Jinhua, had been removed from his position and had been transferred to the Nanzhao border army to be the deputy governor. The governor of the northern expedition camp, Shi Fei, had been summoned back by the emperor to take over the important position of commander of the Jingdo garrison. Above Shi Fei, the governor of the Yanjing camp, Wang Zhikuan, remained where he was. These three transfers of military generals were not normal. Fan Xian knew very well the roles these generals played. He also understood the emperor's different attitudes toward each of them. For example, the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Xiao Jinhua, during the Jingdo rebellion, he was only the commander of the Donghua Gate of the 13 city guards. Because he had stood his ground firmly and forcefully blocked the remaining soldiers of the Qin family, which belonged to the crown prince, within Jingdo, he had performed a great service. That was why the emperor had promoted him 3 levels and made him the commander of the Jingdo garrison. This could be considered the emperor's expression toward a loyal official. Fan Xian had long guessed that the emperor would not let this minor character, Xiao Jinhua, be the commander of the Jingdo garrison for too long. For one, his foundation was too shallow. It would be difficult for him to convince the masses and take on such an important responsibility as the Jingdo garrison. For another, Xiao Jinhua had come from the 13 city gate guards. The emperor had been bitterly disappointed by their performance during the Jingdo rebellion. The emperor trusted Zhang Diqing the most, but Zhang Diqing had sided with the eldest princess. Although the emperor had Zhang Diqing killed by 1,000 cuts and destroyed 3 of his clans, he had not vented the anger in his heart. Xiao Jinhua had been caught in the crossfire, but this person presumably knew the use of his symbol. He should be able to accept going to Nanzhao to be the deputy governor. The situation in the Northern Expedition Army was rather complicated. Yan Xiaoi had been killed by Fan Xian on the summit of the mountain. The Qin Kingdom's Northern Expedition camp next at Sangzhou had been implicated in the rebellion and had faced countless purges in the past 2 years. The court had never allowed General Shi Fei to officially take over the position of governor of the Northern Expedition Army. Instead, he only had the right to know that he was under the jurisdiction of the Yanjing camp's Wang Zhikuan. General Shi Fei had been Wang Zhikuan's deputy for the past decade, so there should be no problem with this arrangement. Since the emperor had Shi Fei return to the capital to take over as commander of the Jingdo garrison, the position of governor of the Northern Expedition Camp was empty. Who was it for? Fan Xian shook his head and thought that probably everyone could see clearly that the position of governor of the Northern Expedition Army, which was at the heart of the world struggle, was left for the great prince. It seemed that after the emperor had rested for 2 years, he had finally begun to lay down his chess pieces step by step. During these 2 months, the Overwatch Council and Dingzhou Army had forcefully stabilized the situation in Xiliang and the grasslands. The emperor finally had the spare time to prepare everything in the northeast. However, If the Great Prince was to become the commander of the Qing army's vanguard, control the 100,000 soldiers on the front lines, and become the powerful governor of the Northern Expedition Army, then he would have to accept another of the emperor's arrangements. He would take in a secondary fei. When the troops were sent out, it would be the time for the great Wang Fei to leave court. The Great Prince is not like that. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and thought. Fan Xian furrowed his brows as he thought. The emperor had already paved the way for the Great Prince to lead the Qing army and fight on the battlefield. He was just waiting for the Great Prince to understand his painstaking efforts and walk this path. Although the Great Prince liked the battlefield, he probably wouldn't do such a thing. Thinking of how he would be forced to do such a thing under the emperor's pressure after he returned to the capital, Fan Xian felt annoyed and couldn't help but grunt. Although this grunt was very quiet, it gave Deng Ziyu and Mu Feng a fright. They didn't know what had happened. It's nothing. Hurry and rest. We still have a long journey tomorrow. Fan Xian rubbed the spot between his brows and waved his hand at the two of them. After thinking for a bit, he asked Deng Ziyu to stay. He looked at Deng Ziyu and was silent for a moment. He then said, "You've been stationed in Shangjing for a long time. Do you know how the Northern Qi people view Shi Fei?" During these 2 years, Shi Fei had been stationed in Sangzhou, leading the Northern Expedition Camp to contend against the famous General Shang Shanhu. Although he had suffered some losses, he was not anxious or impatient. He had stabilized the situation very well. Deng Ziyu thought for a bit and then said, "General Shi Fei has always been Governor Wang's assistant in the Yanjing camp. His reputation was not very prominent. It was only after he went to the Northern Expedition Camp 2 years ago that he gradually became known to the Qi people. Although there have been no major battles in the north and south of Sangzhou these 2 years, he was still able to not panic under Shang Shanhu's coercion. Just this point alone proves that Shi Fei's personality leans toward the feminine side." "Feminine?" Fan Xian asked with some disagreement. If it was just the feminine side, why would the emperor have him shoulder such a heavy burden 2 years ago? Deng Ziyu knew what the commissioner was talking about. In the late autumn of the 7th year of the Qing calendar, the Dong Mountain incident and Jingdo rebelled. Everyone seemed to have overlooked the northern camp that Yin Xiaoi had abandoned near Sangzhou. No one thought of its importance. Fan Xian had never forgotten that when the emperor was still trapped on Dong Mountain, he had secretly sent a secret edict to Yinjing for the Yinjing camp to be ready at any time to take over the northern camp in Sangzhou to prevent the northern Qi people from taking advantage of the chaos to invade. This was a very important mission. With Yin Xiaoi's death, thousands of trusted soldiers were captured. If there were no capable generals holding the fort, the northern camp would probably truly rebel. At the time, the general responsible for the emperor's important edict was General Shi Fei. Not many people knew the specific process of how to subdue the northern camp's military morale. As the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian knew. In his opinion, the process of Shi Fei following the edict to subdue the Qing army was like a legend. General Shi Fei only brought a dozen trusted soldiers and entered the northern camp in Sangzhou. Holding the imperial edict in his hand, he easily took control of the northern camp. Faced with 100,000 soldiers, where did this general get his courage and ability to make the northern camp, which Yin Xiaoi had run for many years, as docile as a warhorse? For someone to be able to do such a thing, he was definitely not just feminine. The pain between Fan Xian's brows grew. He kept feeling as if there was a shadow shrouding his mind. The emperor had decided to have the Great Prince lead the army on a northern expedition. This was expected. For a powerful figure like Shi Fei to not stay on the front lines, but instead be transferred back to Jingdo to be the commander of the Jingdo garrison. Who was he targeting? As early as when the former crown prince left for Nanzhou, Fan Xian had deduced that once the eldest princess's power melted like ice and snow, what welcomed him immediately would be the emperor's merciless reduction of power, as well as the palace's merciless attacks on the older figures of the court. During these 2 years, the Overwatch Council's power had been reduced significantly. Fortunately, The emperor's trust in him grew with each passing day. No one in court dared to do anything to him. The elders that worried Fan Xian the most had also gained valuable experience from the Jingdo rebellion. Without waiting for the emperor to act, they automatically disappeared from the stage. His father had long resigned from his position as Minister of Revenue and returned to Danzhou to retire. Although Chun Pingping still held the position of Director of the Overwatch Council, he had long stopped overseeing matters and handed all council affairs to Fan Xian and Yin Bingyan. Furthermore, he had long asked the emperor for his resignation. However, the emperor truly pitted the relationship between them and insisted on not allowing it. Of course, among the people of the older generation, the most tragic was his father-in-law in Wuzhou. During the rebellion in Jingdo, the previous prime minister, Lin Ruofu, had made a miscalculation and handed over all the people he had buried in the court to his good son-in-law. He had originally thought that he could make a comeback. Who would have thought that the emperor would safely return to the capital? All of this had become like a dreamlike bubble. Not only was it a bubble, the emperor was deeply afraid of the previous prime minister's dishonesty. During these 2 years, he had dealt with the prime minister's former followers miserably. Although he didn't use any sinister methods, he had completely uprooted the last of the power Lin Ruofu had left in Jingdo. Concerning this matter, Fan Xian didn't even have the leeway to speak. He could only smile bitterly as he watched all of this. He watched as his father-in-law was terrified in Wuzhou and repeatedly, secretly wrote to the emperor, begging for forgiveness. Fortunately, the emperor gave both Fan Xian and Lin one face and did not continue to pursue the matter with Lin Ruofu. Thinking of it this way, the 3 old men the emperor intended to sweep clean had already consciously retreated to the back of the stage. The Qin court was like an iron bucket. Why had Fei been moved back to Jingdo? Such a powerful figure was not left in the battle to unify the world, but had been moved back to the emperor's side. Who was he targeting? Was it him? Fan Xian's heart dimmed. He no longer thought about these questions. Raising his head, he quietly said to Deng Ziyu, "Don't worry about the matters in Jingdo." He paused, and then said, "No matter what you hear or know, don't worry about it. You have to remember, you are an official of the Overwatch Council and the Emperor's official. I have placed you in Shiliang now for the sake of the lives of the hundreds of millions of people in Qin Kingdom. If you do this well, everything will be fine." Deng Ziyu was the second person to enter the Qinian unit. He had been personally captured by Wang Qinian. Other than Geezer Wang, he was Fan Xian's most trusted aide. These few years, he had been in Shangjing in northern Qi as the head of the 4th Bureau stationed in northern Qi. He knew that the commissioner was promoting him and felt endless gratitude. Hearing the commissioner's inauspicious words, he couldn't help but be startled and speechless. His eyes were filled with worry. The 3 successive heads of the 4th Bureau's Northern Qi spy network in the Overwatch Council were Yin Bingyun, Wang Qinian, and Deng Ziyu. They were all Fan Xian's most capable assistants. If they didn't get into an accident like Wang Qinian, they would all become the top officials of the Overwatch Council in the future. Fan Xian looked at Deng Ziyu calmly. "The Shiliang matter is very important. You have to handle it well. After you return to the capital, you will hold the position of head of the 4th Bureau. This way, it will be easier to get support from the other 7 bureaus. However, don't worry about the other areas for now. Let Yin Bingyun lead them. Do you understand?" "I understand." Deng Ziyu nodded. "Thank you for your grace. Don't let the Hu people take one step into my territory." Fan Xian stared into his eyes. "I have given up so many people and left you, whom I trust the most, in this desolate Shiliang road for at least 2 years. You know why. Don't disappoint me." Deng Ziyu's heart trembled. He knelt down on one knee and solemnly said, "I will not disappoint your hopes." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything more. It was Deng Ziyu's heart that was still filled with emotion. He had followed the commissioner for 5 years, but had never seen him give instructions so seriously. What made him feel even more awed was that although Sir Fan Jr. was only a young man in his early 20s, when he gave instructions and did things, he was calm and steady like an old man who had floated in court for decades. He hesitated for a moment and then said, "Concerning Songji Xianling, The news that Songji Xianling was a Haitang would slowly spread out. At least for now, other than Fan Xian, only Deng Ziyu knew this secret. Hearing this request, Fan Xian fell silent and didn't reply for a long time. A dozen days later, the imperial envoy Fan Xian's group of carriages arrived outside Jingdou. 3 days ago, Fan Xian had given an order for all of the guards of honor and other eye-catching things to be removed. This trip to inspect Shiliang by imperial edict was just a formality. The secret plan was the most important. Additionally, there were some small troubles in Jingdou, so Fan Xian didn't want to be too ostentatious. Thus, the imperial envoy's guards of honor changed and became the carriages of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. There were no problems with the Overwatch Council's travel documents. The soldiers of the City Gate Department also didn't dare provoke them. The group of carriages did not wait for long outside the Western City Gate before heading inside. Fan Xian lifted a corner of the curtain and unconsciously looked out. He couldn't help but think of the first time he entered the capital and how he had caught a glimpse of Yiling, riding in on a horse. Yiling should have already arrived in Dingzhou. 13th Wang would certainly report to the Fan Manor during the new year. However, he didn't know if she would follow. A comforting smile rose to Fan Xian's face. He thought of the spring that year. The girl wore a light-colored dress and a white deerskin hat. Her brows were like distant mountains, and her eyes were clear and bright. Suddenly, a gray shadow charged past the side of the group of carriages and dangerously brushed past the carriage Fan Xian was in. This shadow was very fast and almost startled the horses of the Overwatch Council carriages. The situation was very dangerous. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council unconsciously gripped the handles of the metal drills and prepared to act at any moment. However, Fan Xian had already seen the gray shadow clearly and shook his head. It was just a little girl on a horse. There was no need to be so nervous. However, the girl on the horse charged very quickly and completely disregarded the safety of the commoners and farmers waiting outside the city gate. It made Fan Xian involuntarily furrow his brows. The girl on the horse had to be some noble young lady. Otherwise, she wouldn't be so arrogant. Fan Xian stuck his head out of the window and narrowed his eyes at the girl charging through the city gate. He looked at the group, startled by her horse, as well as an old farmer who had fallen to the ground in fright. His mood became terrible. There were many reasons for his terrible mood, but one of the most important was that the noble young lady was riding a horse in a dress like Yiling. She also wore a white deerskin hat on her head, and it was also the same as Yiling-er's. Whose family is this young lady? Her conduct is so unbearable. Fan Xian asked Mu Feng, beside the carriage. Mu Feng, family worked in the 1st Bureau of Jingdou and was familiar with the members of the noble families in Jingdou. Mu Feng, looked at the disappearing horse in the distance and only shook his head to indicate that he didn't know. It was a member of the Qinian unit who had come out of the city to welcome them who said in a low voice, "It should be the young lady of the Wang family." The Wang family? Fan Xian's brows rose slightly. Other than the daughter of Yinjing Governor Wang Zhikuan's family, which other Wang family in Jingdou dared to be so arrogant? 2 years had passed since the Jingdou rebellion. The Yinjing camp had performed exceptionally well in quelling the rebellion. Not only had they helped the emperor clear the entire Dongshan Road, but they had also taken control of Yin Xiaoyi's northern expedition camp. Presently, Wang Zhikuan was far away in Yinjing, and Shifei had been transferred back to Jingdou. This was the so-called Yinjing faction in the military. It was a time of great imperial favor. Is the young lady of Governor Wang's family. It is said that the governor is grateful for the imperial favor and misses his old home in Jingdou. So he had this young lady return to Jingdou. The present commander of the Jingdou garrison, Shifei, was Governor Wang's subordinate in the past. This young lady calls him uncle. It is said that she liked the elegance of the young lady of Jingdou the most, so the member of the Qinian unit explained in a low voice. A good subordinate would always analyze the situation for the superior to prevent any unnecessary problems. She wants to learn from Yiling. The smile at the corner of Fan Xian's lips was slightly strange. The first time I saw Yiling outside the city gates, the people of Jingdo automatically made way for her. I have also never seen my disciple randomly wave a whip to chase people away. Looking at this scene, he gradually understood who the great prince's secondary fae was. His expression gradually darkened. Don't enter the palace first. Go around to Prince Hutching's manor. Chapter 614. The carriages with the clear Overwatch Council insignia smoothly entered Jingdo's west city gate. At Zinjiku, the carriages dispersed. The two carriages at the front merged inconspicuously into the flow of people on the streets of Jingdo and turned southwest. In a moment, they left behind the liveliness behind them and entered the noble and quiet east side of the city. In the distance, they could see the beasts of the Fan family's manor. The carriages did not stop. Instead, they turned north. The closer they got to the royal palace, the quieter it became. They passed the area around the manor and King Jing's manor, whose doors had been closed for a long time, and came to the street where Prince Hutching's manor was. The carriage was still some distance from the manor's main gate. Fan Xian, in the carriage, could faintly hear the clamor outside the manor's main gate. It looked like a lively scene was happening there. He rubbed his itchy nose and thought to himself that he had guessed correctly again. The young lady of the Wang family's face was full of anger. She had indeed come to Prince Hutching's manor. As for the emperor's thoughts, Fan Xian had already guessed a bit after seeing the young lady of the Wang family, who was pretending to be Dongshi, outside the city gate. Since the great prince was being forced to take a secondary fae in preparation for the future removal of Wang Fei, then this secondary fae had to be of high birth. Only then would she be able to sit in the position of Wang Fei. Furthermore, this young lady was Wang Zhikuan's beloved daughter. In the future, when the great prince led an army to the north, his father-in-law would lead the Yanjing camp to assist him. On the battlefield, the commander and deputy would not be hindered. It would also be of great benefit to the overall situation. As for whether or not the emperor would worry that the great prince and Wang Zhikuan controlled too many soldiers if the young lady of the Wang family actually became Prince Hutching's fae, that was a problem for the future. With the lesson of the second prince, Fan Xian did not think that the emperor would give his sons too many opportunities to let their imaginations run wild. The daughter of an important military official marrying a prince, the prince should be secretly cautious. Otherwise, who knew if he would end up like Li Chengze and be sold out cleanly when things came to a head? Fan Xian couldn't resist laughing mockingly. The emperor's arrangements were far-sighted. If the great prince wanted to lead an army to conquer northern Qi, the great Wang Fei's identity as a northern Qi princess was indeed an obstacle that was difficult to get around. However, Fan Xian felt a strong revulsion toward this kind of arrangement. Putting aside the relationship between him and the great princess of northern Qi, just seeing the vile young lady of the Wang family at the city gate made Fan Xian develop a deep suspicion toward the emperor's vision. Picking a daughter-in-law for yourself, you have to pick a good one. A woman like this, if she really entered the Wang Fu, I'm afraid the entire Fu will not be at peace. Fan Xian immediately denied his silent criticism of the emperor. The emperor never cared much about women. Marriage alliances were just some transactions. As for this woman's character and whether or not she would bring benefits to his son, he did not care at all. As for the manor becoming restless because of the young lady of the Wang family, perhaps this was the effect that the emperor wanted to see. The great prince's status was noble. Prince Hutching's manor took up half of the long street. The eastern part of the city was silent. No one dared to laugh at the great prince in such an important place. Although there was some noise outside the front door of the manor, other than the two carriages of the Overwatch Council, no one else was spying on them. My lord, it's a little inconvenient to go there now. Why don't we return to the estate first? Although Fan Xian had come to Shiliang in the name of an imperial envoy, in reality, he was carrying out a secret edict. He didn't need to return to the capital to enter the palace to reply to the edict. Mu Feng, watched as Prince Hutching's manor door turned into a market. He thought to himself, the prince must have lost some face. If the commissioner came to visit now, it would probably be inconvenient. However, Mu Feng was still not as good as Wang Qinian at guessing Fan Xian's intentions. Fan Xian had come to Prince Huqing's manor to watch the excitement. He listened intently in the carriage. He had already understood where the excitement outside Prince Huqing's manor door came from. The young lady of the Wang family's voice was so loud that it was difficult not to understand. Although the emperor's edict for the great prince to take on a secondary fey had not been made public, he had already done some work in secret. Those who should know this news had long known. As the people involved, the great prince and Wang Zhikuan knew even better. Yesterday, the new commander of the Jingdo garrison, Shi Fei, had personally invited the great prince to a banquet. At the banquet, he had orchestrated a chance encounter between the great prince and the young lady of the Wang family. Unexpectedly, the great prince was a straightforward person. The moment he saw the young lady of the Wang family, it was like he had seen a ghost. He fled and did not give the other party any chance to speak. The young lady of the Wang family had lived in Yinjing. As the daughter of the governor, when had she ever suffered such humiliation and grievance? Particularly when she thought about how she would have to pitifully be a secondary fey after entering the manor. She held her anger in her heart. She clearly knew that it was the palace's edict for her to marry the great prince. So why was she angry at her? The young lady of the Wang family could not understand it, no matter how she thought about it. As an admirer of the previous pride of Jingdo, Yiling, she had a lot of admiration for this prince who had once led troops to conquer the western frontier for many years. Perhaps she had been incited by a serving girl, or perhaps her own thoughts had burrowed into a dead end. But she had completely disregarded etiquette and ridden into the capital alone to run to the manor. After Shi Fei learned of this, he did not dare to be careless. He quickly sent people to chase after her. However, when they reached Prince Huqing's manor, no one could do anything to this young lady or pull her back. The reason the young lady used was also laughable. She said she had come to Prince Huqing's manor to visit Wang Fei. Fan Xian had to admit that although this reason was absurd and laughable, the interactions between the women of Jingdo's nobility were considered normal. Even Fan Xian had not thought that Wang Fei would be as straightforward as her man. She closed the doors tightly and refused to accept guests. She didn't even say that the master of the manor was away. She just straightforwardly said that the manor had business to attend to and could not receive guests. The young lady of the Wang family felt even more wronged. She had already willingly lowered her status to come and visit a foreign woman, yet she still used her status to close the door. Thus, she began to make a ruckus outside the manor. This woman had Yiling straightforwardness, but she did not have Yiling sense of propriety. Making a ruckus was truly a headache. Her personal soldiers and guards looked at this scene in terror. Looking at Prince Huqing's tightly closed doors, they felt anger in their hearts. They thought, what kind of place is this? This is Prince Huqing's manor. Even if the young lady could do as she pleased in Yinjing, how could she act like this in Jingdo? If she truly angered the prince in the manor, who knew what he would do? Fan Xian looked at the scene in the distance with slight disgust. He thought to himself, if the palace and Shi Fei truly had intentions, how could they not be able to stop a spoiled and barbaric woman from acting rudely? He was afraid that the scene today was purposely done by someone with ulterior motives. They want to make the great prince unhappy and make a ruckus all over the city. In the end, the emperor would speak to sort out the matter and have the great prince suffer in silence. At that time, the emperor could lightly say, the young lady of the Wang family has deep feelings for you and has already come to your door. Are you not going to take responsibility? Another example would be, the people of Jingdo all know of this matter. As the eldest son of the royal family, how could you not care about the face of the royal family? I will give you half a month to settle this matter and bring that woman into the family. Then I won't blame you. They were all small tricks, shameful methods, but they were the ones Fan Xian was most familiar with. He furrowed his brows and thought to himself, the great prince was very close to him. This was a difficult matter. At the very least, he would have to handle the shameful matter in front of him. He ordered Mu Feng go knock on the door." Two black carriages drove toward the gate of the mansion. The wheels creaked as if they were a discordant accompaniment to the noble lady's unrelenting and shrewish voice at the gate of the mansion. There were about 30 people surrounding the front door of the manor. They were all family warriors the Wang family had brought back from Yinjing. There were also housekeepers and servants the Jingdo garrison had sent to the young lady. An old housekeeper was crying and begging the young lady to leave some face for the old master and not make a scene at the front door of the manor. Otherwise, when the family became the joke of Jingdo, how could the Wang family continue to stay in Jingdo? When the two carriages neared the front door of the manor, the housekeeper quickly shut his mouth. In any case, his young lady was not willing to listen to him. The family warriors and servants stared warily at the two black carriages. They thought that the young lady was making a scene. If someone saw it and it got out, it would probably not be good. Only the young lady of the Wang family had one foot on the stone lion and was pointing at the front door of the manor. She was still displaying the power of a starlet facing the ocean and cursing endlessly. Fan Xian's voice came out of the carriage. "Whose family is this girl? Making a scene in the middle of the street. Do you have any manners?" These words were said with the arrogance of one's age and experience. It was also a phrase that Fan Xian had thought of after pondering for a long time in the carriage. After these words were said, the expressions of the people surrounding the front door of the manor changed dramatically. These words appeared normal, but they were unusually vicious. Once they opened, they brought the young lady's current actions to the teachings of the family. It appeared to be criticizing this woman, but in reality, it was directed at the person behind her. A family warrior stared at the two carriages and forcefully suppressed his anger. "I wonder which official has arrived." Other than the young lady, there were no idiots in the Wang and Shi families. Since the newcomer dared to speak so boldly in front of Prince Huqing's manor, he had a background. This family warrior had already noticed the purposefully revealed mark on the carriage and knew that the other party was an official of the Overwatch Council. In the entire Qin court, there were very few officials who dared to not give face to the Yinjing faction of the military. However, the officials of the Overwatch Council had the confidence to do so because they had a very protective old ancestor above them. Although the old ancestor in the wheelchair had gradually retired, an even more protective little ancestor had appeared. Furthermore, this little ancestor was even more ruthless in his actions and had a deeper background. He had only been in the capital for 5 years, and he had already killed a number of ministers. Even people like the crown prince and eldest princess had fallen to his hands. With the protection of such an ancestor, it was understandable that the officials of the Overwatch Council dared to be so arrogant. Before this family warrior returned to the capital, he had received a secret order from the governor that he had to endure and conduct himself in Jingdo. In particular, he could not offend the Overwatch Council. Hearing the person in the carriage mocking the Wang family's teachings, this family warrior was still able to forcefully suppress his anger and maintain his calm as he asked. The person in the carriage did not immediately answer his question. A subordinate lifted the curtain and Fan Xian walked down from the carriage. Among the crowd, he walked to the tightly closed doors of Prince Huqing's manor and turned his head to glance at the woman standing on the stone lion. Although the young lady of the Wang family did things irascibly and her tone was harsh, there was something strange about her. It was clear that outsiders had already arrived, but it was as if she did not see them. She still felt wronged and angrily yelled at the manor until she was watched by this young Overwatch Council official for a long time. She glared fiercely at Fan Xian and scolded, "What are you looking at? Close your dog eyes." After these words were said, everyone fell silent. The Overwatch Council subordinates behind Fan Xian stared coldly at the young lady on the stone lion. Mu Feng's expression twisted. It was as if he could go up at any moment and give this woman a beating. The family warrior and housekeeper realized that something was wrong and quickly moved forward, separating Fan Xian and the young lady. The housekeeper lowered his head and repeatedly apologized. The expression of the family warrior was also very awkward. Fan Xian looked at this scene and was increasingly certain of his guess. The young lady of the Wang family must have been provoked by someone to come to make trouble. The Wang family warriors probably still did not know the reason. With such a steady subordinate, only then would Wang Jikuan be at ease to allow his spoiled daughter to return to the capital. How could he have allowed this young lady to charge into Prince Hutching's manor? Fan Xian looked at the housekeeper and asked, "Which family are you from?" The housekeeper saw that his bearing was extraordinary. Although he didn't know what rank of official he was, Overwatch Council officials often had titles other than court positions. He did not dare to slight him and said, "I am the housekeeper of the Wang family. I have just returned from Yinjing. The young lady has been in Yinjing for a long time and does not know the ways of Jingdou. If she has offended you in any way, please forgive her." Young Lady Wang listened to the two of them speak and pulled her foot back from the stone lion. She scolded, "Who is this? Is there a need to say soft words to him?" The old housekeeper's mouth tasted bitter. The old master had long ordered that he should behave with his tail between his legs in Jingdou, but the young lady had lost her mind for some reason. She had broken free of her family's obstruction and charged into the manor. She had actually called this young official something. Jingdou was not Yinjing. The water was much deeper. Any person on the street could have a terrifying background. "Yinjing?" Fan Xian asked with slight surprise. "Governor Wang's family?" Young Lady Wang stared at Fan Xian and said, "You know my family? And who are you?" Fan Xian didn't even glance at her. Facing the housekeeper and family soldier, he warmly said, "Quickly persuade your young lady to go back. The palace hasn't even issued an edict. If she comes to make a ruckus like this, how will she face others?" The housekeeper and the family soldier repeatedly agreed. They only looked at each other, but didn't go up to help their young lady. They had already tried a few times earlier and couldn't do anything. Fan Xian was slightly startled. Only now did he notice that there were a few whip marks on the old housekeeper's face. Although the force was not deep, blood was gradually seeping out. He turned his head to look and saw that the unruly young lady of the Wang family was holding a horse whip in her left hand. Involuntarily, his expression darkened. He should have treasured such a loyal housekeeper, yet she had used a whip to beat him. His impression of this woman became even worse. Coincidentally, the young lady of the Wang family saw that Fan Xian was ignoring her question and putting on an arrogant expression. She was even more angry. Having been locked outside Prince Hutching's manor for half a day, she had already lost a great deal of face. Now, an unknown young official dared to give her a hard time. How could she endure it? The anger in her heart flared. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her left hand waved, and a whip came crashing down. The horse whip whistled down and was about to touch the tip of Fan Xian's nose. Fan Xian only looked at the woman and thought mockingly in his heart that in this rebirth, the women he had met all had their own beauty. When he was in Danzhou, he couldn't find a bully even if he wanted to. Unexpectedly, he had finally seen a tender fish's eye. With a cracking sound, a few gusts of cold wind flashed past. The horse whip in the young lady's hand broke into 4 pieces in front of Fan Xian and fell to the ground. How could the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council allow an unruly woman to harm their commissioner? With a flash of cold light, 6 or 7 metal rods surrounded the young lady of the Wang family. The housekeeper and the family soldier had no idea that this young Overwatch Council official would have so many aces at his side. They were shocked. Worried about the young lady's safety, they all stood in front of her to protect her. If this had happened in the past, they probably would have guessed Fan Xian's true identity. However, everyone in Jingdou knew that the little ancestor of the Overwatch Council was still on his way back from patrolling Shiliang on behalf of the Emperor, so they hadn't thought of this for a moment. Both sides were ready to fight at any moment outside the manor. Although the swordsmen of the Overwatch Council were terrifying, the family soldiers Yinjing's Wang Jikuan had sent to protect his daughter were not idle either. Most importantly, the front doors of Prince Hutching's manor were still tightly shut. Fan Xian did not get angry. On the contrary, he smiled merrily as he looked at the young lady of the Wang family and said, "You can continue to curse. I won't stop you. However, in the future, I will go ask Wang Jikuan how he raised a strange person like you. Someday, I will also go ask Shifei if he, as your uncle, Doesn't have time to teach you, and if you want me to teach you. In the Qing court, there were no more than 3 young people who dared to directly call Governor Wang and Commander Shi by their names. Other than the 2 princes, there was only that young man. The housekeeper and the family soldier met each other's eyes and saw the shock and regret in each other's hearts. Even their lips began to tremble. Unfortunately, the young lady of the Wang family was stupid. Hearing the other party directly call her father by his name, she said in a great anger, "Who do you think you are? How dare you make irresponsible remarks to father and say you will discipline me?" Fanxian glanced at her and smiled coldly. "I can even subdue a wild horse like Yiling, much less a lame donkey like you." After saying this, he paid no more attention to the terrified and uneasy figures of the Wang and Shi families. Directly climbing up the steps, he banged on the front door of Prince Huqing's manor and angrily said, "Have you seen enough? Hurry up and open the door." No matter how stupid the young lady of the Wang family was, at this moment, she finally knew the other party's identity. Her heart was a mess for a moment. Tears flowed freely from her eyes. However, the tears flowed without rhyme or reason. The front door of the manor was finally pulled open a small opening, but no one appeared. It looked like the manor was only prepared to let Fanxian in. They were still on guard against the young lady of the Wang family, this monstrous figure. Fanxian suddenly turned his head and looked at the young lady of the Wang family. "You like the great prince?" No matter how open-minded the Qing people were, asking about such a private matter between a man and a woman in front of so many officials and servants was going too far. The housekeeper and family soldier gritted their teeth. Disregarding Fanxian's identity, they prepared to scold him. Unexpectedly, the young lady of the Wang family gritted her teeth and said in a loud voice, "I like him. What about it? What about it? I just want to tell you that if I say it won't work, it won't work. Even if it works, it won't work." He paused and then said with slight mockery, "I've been scolding him for a while. Do you want to come in for a cup of tea?" The young lady of the Wang family froze where she was. Unconsciously, she prepared to flee back to Uncle Shi's home. She felt that the young noble in front of her was truly strange and powerful. It made her fearful for no reason. A moment later, she steeled her heart and threw down the broken end of the horsewhip. Stopping the housekeeper's attempts to stop her, she followed behind Fanxian and entered the manor she had dreamed of for a long time. However, the way she entered this time was somewhat special. The front doors of the manor closed tightly behind the 2 of them. Regardless of whether it was the subordinates of the Overwatch Council or the worried family soldiers and housekeepers of the Wang and Shi families, they were all blocked outside the manor. No one knew what Fanxian was thinking by bringing the young lady into the manor. Fanxian was surprised that the young lady of the Wang family dared to look him in the eye and bravely, or rather recklessly, follow him into the manor. Amidst the surprise, a strange feeling rose in his heart. He thought that although this woman was unruly by nature and did not care for her servants at all, compared to Yiling, her posture of cupping one's heart was much uglier. At least there was something good about Yiling. It was directness that was very different from other young ladies in Jingdo. The palace's edict has yet to come out. Have you thought about your father and Commander Shi's feelings by coming here to make a ruckus? Fanxian turned his head and chased the housekeeper of the manor to the side. Looking at the young lady of the Wang family, he coldly said, "As a son, filial piety is the most important. Do you know your mistake by making a ruckus today?" The young lady of the Wang family stared into Fanxian's eyes in shock. She knew the identity of the person in front of her and his powerful abilities. She also knew that her favorite young lady of the Yi family was his anonymous disciple. However, she still had not thought that the moment she entered the manor, his first words would be like her father's and begin to lecture her. Her eyes reddened, and she burst into tears. Sobbing, she said, the king called me shameless." Chapter 6:15. Fanxian lowered his head and moved closer in front of the young lady of the Wang family. He looked at her closely until the bawling woman became uncomfortable. Only then did he say seriously, "Do you know how to write the word shame?" The young lady of the Wang family gritted her teeth and stared fiercely into Fan Xian's eyes. If the king said she did not know shame, she would be hurt, disappointed, and angry. However, she felt even more wronged. That was why she had come to the manor to seek justice from the king. However, for Sir Fan Jr. to say she did not know shame made it difficult for her to accept. Fan Xian straightened his body and gave a glance to the nervous servants in the manor beside him to have them retreat further. Only then did he open his mouth to ask the young lady of the Wang family, "Do you think that making such a ruckus today is very reasonable?" "I just don't know. The king and I have only met once in Uncle's manor. How can I be shameless?" The young lady of the Wang family bit her lip. Her eyes were red like a rabbit ready to pounce and bite at any moment. She stared angrily into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Yesterday, I didn't dare to make a sound at the banquet. I didn't even dare to say a word. In the end, I was called shameless by you. Today, I came to make a fuss and let you see what true shamelessness looks like." Fan Xian felt something was strange in his heart, but he couldn't be bothered to probe deeper. He just couldn't stand the sight of a king being forced by both the palace and an unruly woman to shut himself in. Thus, he had revealed himself and was prepared to teach this woman a lesson on behalf of Governor Wang. However, at this moment, an idea flashed through his mind and he thought of a seemingly good way out. Being watched by Fan Xian's quiet and silent gaze, the young lady's voice became lower and lower. She gradually couldn't vent anymore. She felt like she had seen a ghost. Why was it that when she saw this young noble, her aura immediately disappeared without a trace? No matter how much she cheered herself on, she didn't dare to yell at him. In reality, it was still a matter of power. Fan Xian's position was high and important. Within the Qing kingdom, no one doubted he was the #1 person behind the emperor. In addition, 2 years ago, after he had broken the heartbreaking arrow with a stunning spear, his temperament had broken through again. He had long stood firmly in the realm of the upper 9th level and faintly became a first-rate figure below the great grandmaster, with power and aura added together. Even if he was facing Governor Wang, or even the ruthless Yin Xiaoyi of the past, Fan Xian would not have any thoughts of giving way. Now, without the chest by his side, he reckoned that he could still confront Yin Xiaoyi head-on, not to mention that the opponent was a spoiled girl who only knew how to make scene. Furthermore, he was often immersed in the affairs of the Overwatch Council. No matter how bright and gentle his face was, there would always be a glimmer of coldness hidden deep within. This kind of coldness, for a woman like the young lady of the Wang family, was the most terrifying feeling. Facing Fan Xian, the young lady of the Wang family felt an inexplicable fear. She no longer had the imposing manner of stomping on the stone lion and cursing the manor. Instead, she gradually lowered her head and looked pitifully at the tightly closed courtyard door behind her. She wondered if she had made a big mistake by following him into the manor. It was as if Fan Xian did not see her expression at all. He opened his mouth and began to speak harshly, including what he had seen and heard at the west gate of Jingdo, his disgraceful behavior earlier in front of the manor, and the whip marks on the old housekeeper's face. The more he spoke, the colder his words became, and the harsher his tone became. It was as if he wanted to shame the young lady of the Wang family into a crack in the rock. The scene at this moment was wonderful. Including the housekeeper of the manor, all of the servants had hidden far away. Wang Yi and Wang Fei were even more cunning as they hid in the back courtyard and refused to come out to welcome the guests. Inside the gate, in the empty space beside the fake mountain, were Fan Xian and the young lady of the Wang family, the two guests meeting for the first time. Two guests going through a soul-deep re-education behind the main door of the manor looked rather absurd. After using the sharpest words to harshly lecture the young lady of the Wang family in front of him, Fan Xian's mood became much better. Seeing her lowered head and her angry and ashamed expression that she forced herself not to speak, he felt a glimmer of strangeness. This young lady's unruliness was truly loathsome. However, It looked like she knew her unruliness was wrong. Fan Xian was a little surprised. He immediately furrowed his brows and said, "Do you know your wrongs?" The young lady stubbornly did not reply because Fan Xian's words were truly too piercing, particularly this indifferent and bitter tone. It was completely like he was her elder. A moment later, she said in a loud voice, "You are Sister Ye's teacher, not mine. Speaking of Yiling, I have to remind you of something." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. Although she also gallops around Jingdo, she has never hurt anyone. She would not use a whip to whip an old man. She was indeed a very unruliness, but her unruliness was directed at specific targets and not the pitiful common people. The people of Jingdo liked her and let her have her way, not because of Commander Ye's background, but because of her kindness. He smiled coldly at the young lady of the Wang family and said, "If you want to learn from Yiling, you'll have to wash away all of this annoying aura on your body." Sister Yi unruliness toward whom? The young lady of the Wang family opened her eyes wide and did not notice Fan Xian's last words. Fan Xian was startled and incomparably angry. Other than unruliness toward him, who else could she be toward? Shortly after, his expression darkened. After purposely being silent for a moment, he said darkly, "It is not an easy matter to marry the prince. If you can't change your bad habits, there is no way." The young lady of the Wang family was frightened by his expression and unconsciously prepared to flee out of the manor. However, hearing the word marry, her heart burned like a fire. However, she knew that her temper was truly too bad. If she could change it, the teaching nannies the palace had sent these days would not have such a headache. Speaking of which, it was funny. After Fan Xian's mockery, this woman actually became a bit more self-aware. "I am willing to change." Her face was completely covered in tears. It is easy to change mountains and rivers, but it is difficult to change a person's nature. Fan Xian stared at her and smiled slightly. "Take me as your teacher. I will cut off all of your thorns." The young lady of the Wang family felt a chill in her heart. She was terrified and also a glimmer of anger. Although he was the emperor's illegitimate child and had unparalleled power, he was, after all, only a young man in his 20s. How could he have the nerve to be her teacher? She immediately remembered that the person in front of her had been the teacher of the third prince and Sister Ye's teacher. Although he was young, he had already taken 2 students. One was her idol, and the other should be the future emperor of Qin Kingdom. Now, he was willing to take her as a disciple? Fan Xian did not give her any time to think. With his hands behind his back, he walked coldly toward the depths of the manor. The young lady gritted her teeth, lifted her skirt, and ran after him. Running behind Fan Xian, she was very careful. She finally understood that perhaps Sir Fan Jr. was willing to take her as a student because he truly wanted to create an opportunity for her to enter the manor. The emperor was prepared to have Sir Fan Jr., after he returned to the capital, persuade the prince to take a secondary fey. This inside information had already spread. The young lady knew that whether or not she could enter this manor depended largely on Fan Xian. Hearing that he was willing to take her as a disciple, how could she not be happy? Fan Xian heard the sound of her footsteps and didn't turn his head. Straightforwardly, he said, "If you want to be my student, you have to be prepared to be beaten by me." The young lady was furious. She had lived for so long. Who dared to beat her? Immediately after, she thought of her own happiness and couldn't help but close her mouth in sadness. "Apologize to your housekeeper. Go find the people who were injured by your horse when they entered the city. Pay the medical fees and apologize." "Yes, sir. Don't let me find out that after you apologize, you have thoughts of revenge in your heart. Don't let this kind of thing happen again." "Yes, sir. Tomorrow, have General Shi send someone to bring you to the Fan Manor. Take 10 whips, and then this first matter will be over." The young lady of the Wang family stood dumbfounded. She had thought that she had already given Sir Fan Jr. enough face by suppressing her anger, agreeing to apologize to the housekeeper, and comforting those lowly commoners. Unexpectedly, this person was actually going to use a whip to beat her. "You're shameless." In Prince Hutching's quiet study, The great prince pointed at Fan Xian's nose and cursed angrily in a trembling voice. Across from him, Fan Xian did not show any weakness. With a face full of anger, he slapped off the great prince's finger and cursed, "You're the shameless one." The great prince said Fan Xian was shameless because he had brought the young lady of the Wang family into the manor and chased her to Wang Fei's residence. Furthermore, the great prince had heard clearly the conversation between Fan Xian and the young lady along the way. Fan Xian had taken her as a student and pulled the relationship between him and the Wang family closer. This made him very angry and confused. These few days, the palace had been secretly urging him to take a secondary fei. They had even picked someone for him. Although the great prince had forcefully resisted a number of times, in the end, no one dared to directly challenge the emperor's authority. His mood was in an unusually violent state. Particularly yesterday, the new commander of the Jingdo garrison, Shi Fei, had specially invited the great prince to a banquet. No matter what, he had to give this face. He had not expected that after 3 rounds of the banquet, Shi Fei would act like a matchmaker and invite the bashful young lady of the Wang family. The great prince immediately knew what was going on. In a rage, he flicked his sleeves and left, not leaving any face for the people from Yanjing. What made the great prince most angry was the attitude Fan Xian had displayed earlier. He had been vexed these past few days, but he had thought that once Fan Xian returned, his shockingly capable brother would certainly be able to think of a way to satisfy both sides. He would be able to cancel this marriage and make the emperor happier. At the beginning, the scene at the gates of the manor had made the great prince very happy. He thought that a crafty and unruly person like the young lady of the Wang family would indeed need someone as sinister as Fan Xian to deal with. He had not expected that Fan Xian's attitude would undergo a drastic change later on. Not only did he bring the young lady into the manor, he had also taken her as a student. "How am I shameless?" the great prince roared at Fan Xian. He had called Fan Xian shameless because he had disregarded their brotherhood and dragged him into the abyss. He had not expected that Fan Xian would dare to call him shameless. "You're not shameless?" Fan Xian's face was full of anger. "What is the point of dragging me into the mess of your own manor? You dared to offend the emperor and the generals in Yanjing. Do you want me to offend them as well? She's just a silly little girl. With the means you and your husband have, you can easily get rid of her at any time. You even had to eagerly send the horse to me for me to handle. You too forcefully dragged me into the water. Isn't that shameless?" The great prince was speechless. After discussing it with Wang Fei for a dozen days, he felt that in the current situation, it seemed that only Fan Xian could resolve this problem. He indeed had thoughts of dragging him into the water. He coughed and said guiltily, "In any case, Father was prepared to have you come to the manor to be a lobbyist. I'll pull you to my side first so that we can argue more in the future." "Huh, I'm not a matchmaker," Fan Xian scolded without good humor. The great prince said seriously, "But you are an official of Taichung Temple." Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. The official of Taichung Temple was in charge of the matters of the royal family. As for the marriages of the princes, and dukes, it was up to him to handle. The two of them fell silent at the same time. After experiencing the Jingdo rebellion 2 years ago, this pair of brothers were no longer like before, only relying on their relationship with Chun Pingping and Lady Ning to stand shoulder to shoulder. They truly had the friendship of killing enemies together and the feeling of living and dying together. In these 2 years, their relationship could not be better. "What do you mean by taking her as a student?" The great prince stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "You know, I don't want to take on a secondary fei. Let's not talk about this for now. Let's talk about the young lady of the Wang family." Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, "This girl's family name is Wang Tong. She is Governor Wang's precious daughter. At yesterday's banquet, she did not lose her composure like she did today. Why did you call her shameless?" The great prince said, "Although this girl's personality is rumored to not be good, I've only seen her once. As a prince, how could I rashly criticize the daughter of a general?" Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, I knew you weren't that kind of person." These words were gossip that the teaching nannies in the palace passed through the serving girls of the Wang family to Miss Wang's ears. That is why she came to make such a fuss today. It is clear that the palace wants her to make a fuss so that the entire city knows, and Wang Fei is secretly angry. He raised his head and looked at the great prince. She is, after all, a daughter of the Wang family. Her status is sufficiently noble. Furthermore, as you know, ever since the Dong Mountain incident, the Qing court's attitude toward Northern Qi has undergone a great change. Everyone's attitude toward Wang Fei is not what it was before. The great prince nodded silently. Wang Fei had not been willing to leave the manor these 2 years because she did not want to endure the hostile gazes of the common people of the Qing kingdom. Northern Qi had participated in the plot to assassinate the emperor. No one could escape this hatred. Thus, if this matter truly becomes a scandal and the emperor directly decrees a marriage, I'm afraid all the civil and military officials in court will support it. Wang Fei must abdicate. All the civil and military officials in court. The great prince furrowed his brows and refuted. This Miss Wang's reputation is not very good. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "Who are you?" "You are the eldest son of the royal family, the only prince who can lead a northern expedition. You are the pride of the Qing kingdom." "Never mind, Miss Wang. As long as your Wang Fei can change from a northern Qi person to a Qing person, even if she is a Cao, these officials, scholars, and people will carry her into the manor for you." The great prince's heart chilled. It was as if he saw a large white Cao tied to a pole with red ribbons around her body being carried into the manor amidst the sound of trumpets and suona. I already understood on the way here. Regardless of whether it is you or me, neither of us can stop this matter. There are only 2 of us. How can we oppose the entire court? Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. You want to reject the marriage and also make the emperor happy. This is impossible. The great prince sat down dejectedly. He had completely lost the heroic spirit he had when he attacked Western Hu. He muttered to himself, "Do I really have to take a secondary Fei? If you don't want the matter to become too big and the emperor to be angry and directly depose your Wang Fei because of jealousy of not having an heir, then taking a secondary Fei is inevitable. At least it could drag on for a while." Fan Xian looked at him with pity, thinking that a prince leading an army was indeed much more miserable than he was. "Look at all the officials in the court," he said in a comforting voice. "Who doesn't have 3 wives and 4 concubines? Even that old Shu Wu has a few concubines in their 20s in his manor. Wang Fei is a reasonable and courteous person. She won't argue too much about the matter of taking a secondary Fei. Multiple wives? Why don't I see you taking a few more?" The great prince said angrily. He then fell silent. He knew that the matter of taking a secondary Fei could not be dragged on. He also knew that Fan Xian had purposely not brought it up. The so-called taking a secondary Fei was actually a preparation to depose Wang Fei in the future. Although the great prince and Wang Fei were a political marriage during the honeymoon period of the 2 countries, the 2 of them were harmonious and had a good relationship. If Wang Fei was truly deposed, he would not accept it no matter what. Although Wang Tong and I have only met for the first time today, we have spoken a few words. Seeing the change in the great prince's expression, Fan Xian said evenly, "If you want to take a secondary Fei, she is the best choice. Otherwise, my attitude would not have changed so much." Just this. The great prince suddenly stood up. In the end, he still had a generous personality and resisted scolding that woman. Chapter 616. Even though Wang Tong had blocked the front door of the manor and scolded him for a long time, the great prince still perfectly maintained the image of a mature man. Up until now, he had not said a single harsh word to the young girl. Although the other party was the daughter of the governor of Yanjing, the first prince was a legitimate prince. The difference in their statuses made it so that he did not have to consider too much. However, he still tried his best to maintain a calm state of mind. After hearing Fan Xian's words, He did not follow and scold the girl for being a scoundrel. He only furrowed his brows and said, "Who knows why you took her on as a student?" "I don't believe you can't guess," Fan Xian said with a smile. "Of course, I'm worried that after the manor already has a tigress, there will be another little leopard. If I can teach this young lady of the Wang family to be well-informed, well-mannered, and well-behaved, what are you afraid of taking her on as a disciple?" After going around and around, Fan Xian was still urging the great prince to take a secondary fei. The great prince said angrily, "I really don't know where your usually admirable foresight has gone. How dare you say this silly girl is not a good choice?" "What's not good?" Fan Xian's smile faded, and he said seriously, "I don't need to remind you. You should know that your roots are in the military. She is Wang Zhikuan's daughter. If you take her on as a secondary fei, your relationship with the military will certainly become closer. Don't forget, although your prestige in the military is high, the Western Expedition Army has long been broken up. You cannot return to Dingzhou, and your position as commander of the Imperial Army has also been removed. This is my father's intention." The great prince's expression became cold. "Unexpectedly, your calculations are as good as my father's." Fan Xian raised his brows and sat down. Everyone can see the emperor's intentions clearly. There has to be a woman entering the manor and keeping an eye on the position of Wang Fei at all times. If you don't want Wang Fei to be deposed, then having Wang Tong enter the manor is better than having someone else. The great prince stared at him with confusion. He wondered why Fan Xian's intentions had changed so much. He firmly believed that Wang Tong was the best choice. Wang Tong's background was very deep. She had the military and Yinjing factions supporting her. Additionally, the emperor was secretly letting her go. Once this woman entered the manor, she would immediately threaten Wang Fei's position. The reason why I said that Wang Tong is a good choice is because this girl really likes you," Fan Xian said. "Furthermore, although this young lady's personality is a bit shrewish and vicious, she is a girl who walks the path of slashing and killing. This kind of person looks troublesome, but it is actually easier to deal with. You don't want the new secondary fei in the manor to be like the eldest princess, who appears weak on the surface, but is actually incomparably powerful in the dark." The first prince thought about it, and realized that this was indeed the case. Wang Tong dared to come to the prince's mansion to cause trouble before the edict from the palace had been issued. She was indeed not a woman who walked the path of a seductive woman. But he thought about it again, and still frowned and said, "But she is only a 15-year-old girl. She is not sensible at all. What if after entering the palace, she holds a kitchen knife every day? What should we do?" "His Majesty means that we can't openly resist." Fan Xian looked into his eyes and quietly advised, "But we could try to deal with it in another way. As for whether or not Wang Tong will cause trouble in the future, that will depend on how I, her teacher, teach her, and how you two respond." He took a sip of tea and suddenly felt that his heart was becoming harder and harder. After a self-mocking smile, he said, "It's still that old saying. Wang Tong likes you, so as long as she enters the manor, she will treat you as her sky. Whether a person is satisfied or not depends mainly on what they wish for. If it was another young lady, perhaps she would not be satisfied if she didn't become a Wang Fei. I think Wang Tong will probably be satisfied if she marries you." The first prince glanced at him non-committally and lightly said, "How can you be so sure of a girl's thoughts? If we really take her into the manor and she causes chaos in the manor, are you going to clean up?" I'll do it. Fan Xian shrugged and said, "When it comes to a girl's thoughts, there is no other man in the world who understands them better than me. You have to have confidence in me." The great prince thought that Fan Xian's words were not arrogant. Just looking at how many young girls have been mesmerized by Story of the Stone and his glorious accomplishments in his life. Not only had he mesmerized his beloved sister Chen to death, but he had also mesmerized the saint girl of northern Qi's Tianyi Dao to the point of losing her soul. From this, one could tell that his judgment was reasonable. "I just don't understand why Miss Wang has to keep an eye on me. You have to know that we only met once at Shi Fei's banquet." The great prince stared at Fan Xian and said, to like someone at first sight. If the other party was a monster like you, it might be possible. Women and men are two different creatures. Fan Xian patted his shoulder with pity and said, "If a man like you can't understand, then don't think about it." The great prince spat angrily and immediately thought of a problem. For a busy official like you to take Wang Tong, as a female student, it is not just because of me. Fan Xian smiled awkwardly and said, "You already understand. So what are you asking?" "You have to know that I'm not like you. Other than the Black Knights, I have nothing else. It's not wrong to have a good relationship with the military elders. I don't want a second Qin family that hates me to the bone to appear." The great prince paused for a moment and then sighed. "Yi Zhong's girl has always listened to you. Now, you won't even let Wang Zhiquan's daughter go." Truly, these words sound awkward. Fan Xian rubbed his nose and laughingly scolded, "I'm not an animal. These two are your brother's wives. You can't speak blindly. But they're also your female students," the great prince said with a deep smile. "Additionally, Hongcheng is in Dingzhou. Although father has always strictly forbidden you from participating in the military, no matter how you think about it, you will soon have connections to the armies of Three Roads. Your calculations are not any less than father's. You underestimate me. Although Fan Bingyan once said that I seem to be conquering the world through conquering women, with 2 roads of armies and the power of the Yi family, I am not stupid enough to want to use 2 female students to influence anything." Fan Xian smiled. "However, I am willing to improve my relationship with the military." As he said these words, Fan Xian's emotions were complicated. He had come to Jingdo and entered the complicated Jingdo officialdom. He had already influenced the world for a full 5 years. His efforts to reach out to the Qing military had all, without exception, come to nothing. Although the emperor's wariness toward him seemed to have lessened greatly, and had Li Hongsheng, who was on good terms with him, become the general of Dingzhou, if Fan Xian truly wanted to fight his way into the military, it would still be difficult. For example, the Jiaozhou Navy. Fan Xian had once used Su Maotsai's help to gradually arrange for his trusted aides to enter. He was prepared to wait for the old Qin family to rebel and then secretly take over the Jiaozhou Navy's power. He had not thought that the emperor would not let go of this slight change, and directly knocked Su Maokai into the dust. Although the emperor had mercifully left Su Maotsai's life for Fan Xian's sake, the entire Jiaozhou Navy was moving further and further away from Fan Xian's hands. Furthermore, Ho Jichong, who Fan Xian had remained in Jiaozhou, had done 2 years of useless work because of this matter and wasted a great deal of time. It was becoming more and more difficult to advance on the official road. Presently, not only was he far from Yang Wanli's reputation in the Ministry of Works, he was even much worse than Cheng Jialin, who had already become the Suzhou Zhizhou. Ho Jichong was the person Fan Xian admired the most of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. That was why he had entrusted Jiaozhou, such an important place, to him. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian's one wrong move had caused this Jingdo talent, who had once been as famous as He Zhongwei, to still be able to endure his official reputation in the remote Jiaozhou. Presently, the emperor's favor and trust toward Fan Xian could not be any greater, but he was still on guard against him entering the military. This reality made Fan Xian's heart beat like a drum. He didn't know if the emperor knew something, or if the emperor often had nightmares about the incident 20 years ago. Additionally, Su Maokai was an old member of the Chuanzhou Navy, so he was still wary of his son, Fan Xian. "You need to have a good relationship with the military." "I don't." The great prince's words pulled Fan Xian out of his thoughts. He forced a smile and said, "But you need to maintain a good relationship with the emperor. As for me, as long as the emperor does not obstruct me, not only do I want to have a good relationship with the military, but Wang Zhikuan and the other military elders also want to have a good relationship with me. If I take his daughter as a student, he will probably wake up laughing in the middle of the night." The great prince raised his brows. He knew that Fan Xian was speaking the truth. In the present Qing kingdom, purely in terms of power and status, there was no one more glorious than Fan Xian. Additionally, Everyone knew that he was the flesh and blood of the Qing emperor and the mistress of the Yi family. With this connection, all of the officials and generals would unconsciously curry favor with him. After the two of them finished speaking, they fell silent at the same time. The great prince thought helplessly that it looked like the matter of taking a secondary fey would be difficult to resolve. Fan Xian was thinking, when exactly would the suspicion the emperor had toward him in the depths of his heart be dispelled? Tell me about the matter in the west. The great prince suddenly furrowed his brows and said seriously, what exactly is going on with the Hu people? There has to be a reason for their great increase in power these 2 years. You'll know when the imperial bulletin comes out in a few days. Fan Xian had long known that the great prince would be unable to resist asking this question. The great prince had fought in the west for many years and was very familiar with the grasslands. He had killed the Hu people until their cries shook the heavens. If the emperor had not been worried that his eldest son's service was too great and could no longer be conferred a title, he would not have moved him back 3 years ago. Although the great prince had long returned to the capital, his heart often floated to the grasslands. He was very concerned about the situation there. The great prince saw that he was not willing to answer and shook his head helplessly. Hanqing has become more and more promising these 2 years. However, the Hu people are ruthless and bloodthirsty. You have to remind him more. After Fan Xian nodded, he suddenly furrowed his brows and asked seriously, the Qing kingdom and the Western who have fought for decades. Each time, it looks like we have a great advantage and are about to completely resolve the problem. Why is it that each time, the Hu people's power is like wild grass after the spring breeze and grows again? The great prince had a lot of right to speak on this question. That is because the grasslands are too big. Going west from the southern edge of the sky, there is no end to the grasslands. Once the Qing kingdom has the absolute advantage, they will flee west. How can we completely resolve the problem? This time, I found that the Western Hu court is not particularly far from Dingzhou, Fan Xian asked with confusion. The great prince glanced at him with slight mockery and said, the Hu people's court is not Jingdou or Shanjing. By the time we attacked there, they had long moved into the depths of the grasslands. It is only because the Hu people are powerful that they dare to move the court not far from the border. Putting aside the years I fought against the Hu people in the West, just talking about 20 years ago, Father personally led the army of the entire country to the grasslands with the intention of wiping out the Hu people in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, in the end, it was all for naught, the great prince said with some regret. The power of the entire country, the imperial army personally attacking, and Father's genius military ability were still unable to subdue the Hu people in one fell swoop, much less people like us. When Fan Xian heard that the Qing emperor had personally led the imperial army on an expedition 20 years ago, his expression became serious. He didn't reply because he remembered clearly that during that western expedition, his father, Fan Jian, had also followed in the camp. During that time, a shocking change had happened in Jingdou. This change ended a woman's life and gave him a second life. In the arms of the blind uncle, he sat in a carriage and went to Danzhou. The great prince did not notice Fan Xian's strange expression. Slowly, he said, at that time, the old chief had just passed away and the Hu people were in internal strife. It was the best opportunity for the Qing kingdom. It was truly a pity. What is most puzzling is that at that time, Commander Yi had handed over the Jingdou garrison by imperial edict and personally became the vanguard of the army. The elite cavalry had already followed the Western Hu court. As long as Father's camp could hold out for another 3 days, they would have been able to capture all of the Western Hu nobles in one fell swoop. However, at this time, the army suddenly stopped advancing westward and turned to retreat into the borders of the country, leaving the Western Hu people with a breath. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then raised his face and smiled slightly at the great prince. The reason for the army's retreat is very simple. Presumably, at that time, the emperor already knew of my mother's death. The great prince's heart trembled. Only now did he think of the important matter that had been sealed away for many years. Looking at Fan Xian's forced smile, The great prince's pity rose in his heart, and he did not continue this topic. A moment later, the great prince coughed and changed the topic back to the beginning. Is taking a secondary fae really not to be stopped? No one dares to disobey the edict. All those who oppose the emperor have not had a good end. Is Wantong a really a good choice? At least, I can't see a better choice right now. Then, how do I tell Wang Fei? Fan Xian laughed and said, you don't need to worry about this problem. Wang Fei has a way to deal with a little girl. As he spoke, someone outside announced that Wang Fei and young Lady Wang had arrived. The great prince and Fan Xian met each other's eyes and both smiled bitterly. After the two women entered, Fan Xian stood and bowed. Without anyone noticing, he observed the expressions on their faces and nodded his head in his heart. Wang Fei was as calm and graceful as usual, but Wang Tong, Er's face was slightly red and shy. It was completely different from her earlier appearance. It looked like after Fan Xian had rushed her to Wang Fei's side, this young lady had received some kind of promise. Fan Xian sighed quietly in his heart. He knew Wang Fei was indeed powerful. She had long made up her mind before these two men, had decided. In order to protect her own interests, she had been forced to make a seemingly compromising choice. It looked like he wouldn't need to make things difficult for Wang Fei to persuade her in a moment. Instead, it would be Wang Fei persuading him to think of the big picture and not go against his father's wishes in the palace. Fan Xian smiled and looked at Wang Fei with narrowed eyes. Faintly, he said a few words. Wang Fei also smiled. The two of them knew exactly what the other was thinking. During the Jingdo Rebellion, the Northern Qi Emperor wanted the great prince to take the throne. Through the brocade guard spies he had sent to Wang Fei's side, he had secretly revealed Fan Xian's whereabouts to the eldest princess and almost caused Fan Xian's death. Fan Xian knew that this matter did not have much to do with Wang Fei. For the sake of the relationship between the great prince and his wife, he had never told the great prince about this matter. However, he and Wang Fei still had a knot in their hearts. Thus, during these 2 years, they had not had much contact. Wang Fei had always felt guilty toward Fan Xian. It was not until now, when the two of them looked at each other and smiled like foxes, that the past melted like a spring breeze and disappeared without a trace. After chatting for a bit, Fan Xian rose to say his goodbyes. He had brought the young lady of the Wang family into the manor. Of course, he had to take her out. After all, the palace had not appointed a marriage. No matter how open the Qing people were, if he allowed Wang Tong or a love-struck fool to wink at the great prince, it would be too unsightly if it got out. Wang Fei pretended to ask him to stay, but a clear light flashed through her eyes. Wang Tong foolishly did not want to leave. She looked pitifully at Fan Xian. Let's go, Fan Xian said. Teacher, where are we going? Wang Tong raised her head and looked at him in surprise. Wang Tong, Er's eyes were filled with anger and refused to speak. Fan Xian's face immediately darkened. For some reason, Wang Tong was innately afraid of Sir Fan Jr. She unconsciously stood up and gritted her teeth as she followed Fan Xian out of the manor. Walking along the way, Fan Xian had long seen the light in Wang Fei's eyes. Looking at Wang Tong beside him, he couldn't help but shake his head. Although this young lady was unruly, if she truly entered the manor, she would not be Wang Fei's match. She probably would not have many good days in the future. Fortunately, Wang Tong Er's background was powerful enough. Presumably, her life would not be too wretched. His Highness was also not that kind of person. In a moment, the two of them arrived at the front door of the manor. Fan Xian didn't know what magic he used to say to this unruly woman. Wang Tong seemed to have completely changed. She obediently and timidly followed behind him. There was no trace of her earlier appearance of stepping on the stone lion and cursing loudly. The front door of the manor opened. The housekeeper escorted them out and then quickly closed the door like he was hiding from a ghost. Fan Xian smiled and scolded, thinking that he had also been caught in the crossfire. In the blink of an eye, he saw Wang Tong, Er's face full of anger, and was about to curse the housekeeper. His face darkened, and he made a sound of acknowledgement. Wang Tong Immediately felt the coldness beside her and shivered. She quickly closed her mouth and obediently walked down the steps. With unusual discomfort, she said a few things to the old housekeeper with the whip marks on his face. The old housekeeper was frightened. When did his young lady's personality change? To the side, the Wang and Sher family soldiers were also scared silly. They wondered if Sir Fan Jr., who was rumored to be Sir Fei Jie's student, had given the young lady some medicine to make her like this. Wang Tong was like a little white rabbit. Everyone at the front of the manor looked at Fan Xian like they were looking at a god. They thought Sir Fan Jr. truly lived up to his reputation. No wonder the emperor had him pretend to be a tutor a few years ago to teach the third prince. This kind of teaching and educating methods was truly wondrous. The Wang family soldiers and housekeepers bowed to Fan Xian with endless gratitude. They then led their young lady out of the manor's front door. Fan Xian watched the group of people disappear into the street. He then shook his head and climbed into his carriage. Although Mu Feng was now the leader of the Qinian unit, in his bones he was still that meddlesome young man from the past. He swallowed and carefully asked, "Sir, what happened? That mother, how did she become like this?" "It's simple." Fan Xian sat in the carriage and closed his eyes to rest. "If she doesn't listen, I'll spank her. I'll have the king marry another woman. I am an official of Taichung Temple. How could she not believe me?" "That's stupid," Mu Feng said with disdain. Everyone knew that this matter related to the great prince taking a fey was not something an official of Taichung Temple could decide. This matter had to be approved by the emperor. If she wasn't stupid, why would the princess allow her to enter the manor? Fan Xian closed his eyes and muttered. He felt incredibly tired. He didn't want to get involved in this kind of thing again. If it weren't for his good relationship with the great prince, he would have gone to the palace long ago to complete his mission and then return to his manor to play with his children. An hour passed, and there was still no movement in the imperial study. The eunuch stood helplessly outside the room. Eunuch Yao glanced at the goat milk and pastries that the person beside him was holding. He found that the food was almost cold and couldn't help but furrow his brows. The young eunuch looked at the door of the imperial study and wondered who His Majesty was talking to for such a long time. Eunuch Yao also glanced at the door and thought it would be best if he did not disturb the father and son talking. Other than the young eunuch who had just arrived, no one else was surprised by the current situation. The emperor had a myriad of affairs to attend to and rarely summoned an official alone for more than a quarter of an hour. Sir Fan Jr. was an exception. During these 2 years, each time Sir Fan Jr. entered the palace, the emperor would always chat with him for half an hour in the imperial study. It was not limited to matters of state and council. A few times, Eunuch Yao had even heard the emperor and Fan Xian argue about the names of the Fan family's 2 children. There was only Fan Xian in the entire world who had such an honor and such favor. The situation in the imperial study was different from what the eunuchs thought. The Qing emperor looked at Fan Xian, sitting to his right, and said, "I have already decided. Wang Tong will eventually enter the manor. Don't meddle in other people's business." Speaking of marriage, a few days ago, Yin Bingyan married that woman. When are you going to explain the matter of Zhaoshang Money House to me? Fan Xian's expression changed slightly. He quickly lowered his head to hide it. Chapter 617. Before I wrote, I looked and found that Wang Tong, Sun character showed a different form. Perhaps it was too skewed. Sun means beautiful. Now, it looks like it needs to be changed to Tong. Also, I want to report something to everyone. I am seriously reserving monthly tickets after the 28th because I want to enter the top 3. I clenched my fist and spoke in a low and forceful voice. Fan Xian had been in the royal study for a long time. In the beginning, he picked the most important things to talk about. Presently, what the Qin kingdom cared about the most was the situation in Shiliang Road and to what extent the plan the emperor had the Overwatch Council prepare 4 months ago had been carried out. Fan Xian spoke confidently and with assurance. The emperor listened quietly. There was not a trace of dissatisfaction on his face. He even said a few rare words of comfort to Fan Xian, saying that he had worked hard. Feeling that the environment was suitable and the timing was just right, Fan Xian's eyes spun. He took this opportunity to say a few idle words about the great prince taking a secondary fey. The gist of this idle talk was completely different from the response he had discussed with the great prince in a manner. He directly used words to humiliate the young lady of the Wang family. At the same time, he expressed his strong desire as an official not to participate in the affairs of the royal family. Just as Fan Xian had expected, the emperor flew into a rage upon hearing these words. He reprimanded Fan Xian, pointed out his identity as an official of Taichung Temple, and said harsh words about the matter of the prince taking a secondary fey. This storm did not make Fan Xian feel any fear. He had been with this unfathomable emperor for a long time. Although he was still unable to see into the depths of his heart, at least he had a clear understanding of his personality and likes. However, such a vigorous scolding often meant that the matter was not serious. As expected, Fan Xian took the opportunity to suggest that since he was an official of Taichung Temple and the emperor was going to marry the young lady of the Wang family to the great prince, he had to think for the sake of the royal family's face. Should he teach the young lady some things? These things were usually done by the old nannies in the palace, yet Fan Xian, a young man, had stolen them. It was unavoidably comical. However, the emperor did not laugh. He directly told Fan Xian not to meddle in other people's business, but he did not get angry. The emperor had probably long known of the story outside the manor and had long guessed why his favorite son had insisted on not allowing it earlier and what benefits he had asked for. Just as Fan Xian felt slightly more at ease, he heard the words Zhaoshang Money House. These 4 words were like a deep brand, burning his heart, causing him to lower his head and remain silent for a moment. He knew why the emperor had chosen this moment to have him hand over Zhaoshang Money House. It was because he had gotten used to this kind of sudden thunder over the past 2 years. If it weren't for his thick skin, he would have been struck by lightning in the past 2 years. Was this the so-called unfathomable saint's heart? Fan Xian thought to himself that although the emperor doted on him to the extreme and allowed him to be free and arrogant in the Qin court, he still did not forget to give him a warning from time to time. Yes, this was what a king would do to the person closest to him. He wanted to wake him up so that he wouldn't get carried away and ruin the relationship between a king and his subject or a father and son. Ever since the Jingdo Rebellion, each time Fan Xian had performed a great service for the court or been heavily rewarded by the emperor would always lightly throw out some things or names to frighten Fan Xian and make him understand the position he was in. The stick the emperor used to beat Fan Xian with in court was He Zhongwei and his group of officials. The real thunder that he struck in private was the things Fan Xian had done in secret. Counting carefully, the things that had served as the emperor's thunder these 2 years included the details of Xia Mingji, Xia Qifei's relationship with the Jiang and water bandits, Fan Xi's smuggling in the north, the first thunder about Su Mount-Sai's impure intentions, why 13th Wang had sought refuge with Fan Xian, and so on and so forth. Each thunder struck directly into Fan Xian's heart and made his entire body cold. He didn't seem to have any secrets in front of the emperor. If these crimes were truly brought out, they would all result in beheading. He knew the emperor would not bear to use these crimes against him. He was only reminding him. Even so, his entire body was still cold. He felt that the Grand Master Emperor on the dragon couch could swallow him with a casual breath. Fortunately, Fan Xian was not a normal official. Faced with the emperor's thunder, his way of dealing with it was also unique. He could only rely on his thick skin. He would admit to the crimes that he had to admit to, but he would continue to do what he had to do. In any case, the emperor didn't want to kill him, so he would continue to muddle along like this. However, he couldn't muddle along anymore. Zhaoshang Money House was too important to Fan Xian. Regardless of whether it was the Overwatch Council's expenses, the silver moved to the Yangtze River to repair the embankments, the Hangzhou conference that Winter hosted, or even the luxurious lifestyle of the entire clan and Qin Garden. They all came from Zhaoshang Money House. Most importantly, Zhaoshang Money House had once hidden millions of liang of silver from the Northern Qi Emperor. Once it was known, This crime of betraying the country could not be hidden no matter how Fan Xian pretended to be a filial son and wailed. A few lines of cold sweat rolled down his back. 3 years ago, when he had subdued the old man of the Ming family who was not afraid of boiling water, Zhaoshang Money House had been forced to walk onto the stage. He had guessed that this matter would certainly arouse the emperor's suspicions. The Ministry of Revenue had not moved this much silver. The emperor would certainly wonder where the silver in the money house came from. Fan Xian had made a lot of preparations for this secret. He confirmed that he had already cleaned up the accounts in the north. In the past, the emperor had also asked about the source of Zhaoshang Money House's money. At that time, Fan Xian had used the most famous rumor in the world to brush it off. Everyone thought that the mysterious shares in Zhaoshang Money House were the secret wealth that the commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guards, Shen Zhong, had saved up after decades of operation. Now, the emperor had asked directly. Furthermore, he had mentioned the young lady of the Shun family, who had been married to Yin Bingyun for less than 3 months. He was warning Fan Xian that the young lady of the Shun family had always been under his control, but she had also always been in the emperor's eyes. Don't use the Shun family's inheritance as a bluff again. 2 more lines of cold sweat appeared on Fan Xian's back. However, it was already late autumn and the beginning of winter. Although there was a fire burning in the royal study, it was still cold. The official robes he wore were thick. For a moment, it was impossible to tell. His expression remained valiantly calm. "Your Majesty, what do you want to explain?" The emperor's expression darkened. He was very displeased that this kid still wanted to bluff his way out of such a private conversation. He had no idea that Fan Xian's heart was beating like a drum. He wondered if the little emperor in the north held a grudge against him for wantonly killing Northern Qi spies in Shiliang Road and thus tossed out this secret agreement and used the Qing emperor's hand to kill him. Did Northern Qi hate him that much? Were they willing to pay such a high price to get rid of him? Fan Xian's expression could no longer maintain its calm. Sweat beaded slightly on his forehead. He thought, since that little strange creature from Northern Qi dared to toss out knives, who knew if he dared to toss out the money house? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the clear displeasure on the emperor's face. Seeing this displeasure, Fan Xian was overjoyed. If the emperor truly knew the inside story of this matter and wanted to take him down, given his shrewdness and cultivation, how could he be so sincerely displeased? Fan Xian smiled awkwardly and coughed dryly. He then said, "The silver at the beginning of Zhaoshang Money House was indeed not the Shun family's treasure. It was my own private stash." This answer was very clever. If a normal official had heard these words, they would certainly have cursed Fan Xian for being shameless and disgusting. Zhaoshang Money House had millions of liang of silver as its foundation. Whose private stash could be that much? However, when the emperor heard these words, he clearly revealed an expression as if he knew everything. Faintly, he said, "As expected, when did Lao Wu give this money to you?" Fan Xian laughed bitterly and replied respectfully, "It was only before I went to Jiangnan that Uncle Wu Zhu knew I needed money." The emperor looked at him and shook his head. Lao Wu is also messing around. Why would he give such a large sum of silver to a child like you? Fan Xian let out a big breath in his heart. He knew that the emperor was, as he had expected, thinking of the old Yi family. However, there was still a strange smile on his face. It was as if he was silently criticizing the emperor for coveting this money. It was also as if he was silently criticizing the emperor for helping him earn millions of liang of silver after he took over the Jiangnan Palace treasury. Yet he was still not satisfied. The emperor clearly saw what Fan Xian's expression was hiding. He angrily scolded him in a low voice. A moment later, he forcefully suppressed his anger and pretended to be unintentional. "This palace treasury was left behind by your mother. Do you think I care about those millions of liang of silver? However, don't spend the silver your mother left you carelessly." Fan Xian did not dare to be negligent. He quickly explained each and every use of Zhaoshang Money House's money. The emperor knew these things very well, but it was always better to explain them clearly one by one. Furthermore, Now that he had made it clear, he couldn't bring up old debts in the future. The emperor stroked his beard with satisfaction and nodded his head. Of course, it is good to use it for good deeds. Chinner is also someone who can do things. Don't always lock her up in the manor. When she has nothing to do, let her enter the palace to keep me company. Fan Xian thought to himself that he had never locked up his lovely wife. Presently, she was busy managing the affairs of the entire Fan family. Additionally, because of the Jingdo rebellion, it was inevitable that she would develop some conflicting feelings toward her uncle, the emperor. She did not want to enter the palace. Take good care of the matters in the west. The emperor stood and suddenly thought of something. Pretending to be unintentional, he asked, "Where did Lao Wu go?" "I don't know where he went." Fan Xian also quickly stood and said, "I saw him once 2 years ago. This kid always likes to disappear. How did he learn the same temper as Uncle Yi?" The emperor said with a headache. He then waved his hand, indicating for Fan Xian to leave. The door to the royal study was finally pushed open. Fan Xian walked out with a calm expression. Seeing Eunuch Yao waiting to the side, he nodded his head in greeting. Eunuch Yao quickly lowered his body and bowed. Lowering his voice, he asked, "How is your Majesty's mood?" Fan Xian smiled. The dark clouds on his face quickly turned into a patch of sunlight. It was incomparably brilliant, but his mood was heavy. Every time he entered the palace to see the emperor, it was a day of suffering for him. The omnipresent pressure and the sense of authority of an emperor and grandmaster made him very uncomfortable. Particularly, he had to occasionally endure a lightning strike like the one he had today. It was truly unpleasant. When the emperor asked about Wu Zhu's whereabouts at the end, Fan Xian couldn't help but mock coldly in his heart. Of the two foreign great-grandmasters, one was dead and the other was crippled. Yi Liuyun's existence was clearly not necessary for the Qing kingdom. This figure, whose nature was like that of a wild crane or a leisurely cloud, had truly floated far away after helping the Qing emperor complete the situation at Dong Mountain. It was impossible for him to appear again. Although the emperor had acted naturally when he asked about Wu Zhu, Fan Xian knew that the emperor had always been secretly cautious and on guard toward Uncle Wu Zhu. As for why it was like this, Fan Xian knew very well. Walking along the long eaves of Taiji Palace toward the lofty royal palace, his expression gradually calmed. Private conversations like this in the royal study had occurred many times. From the discomfort he had felt when he first faced the lightning to how he handled it now, Fan Xian had grown a great deal. Standing under the lofty Taiji Palace and looking at the stone steps carved with dragon clouds, Fan Xian took a deep breath and let the cold early winter air quickly enter his chest. The icy coldness was incomparably comfortable. The things the emperor knew were things Fan Xian was not afraid of letting him know. Although the lightning strikes were terrifying, they could not shatter the hard outer shell in Fan Xian's heart. He still had many secrets that he had successfully kept from the emperor, such as Zhaoshang Money House, the death of a few shopkeepers in Qingyu Hall, Uncle Wu Zhu's true whereabouts, and a small workshop slowly taking shape in a small country controlled by Dongi. For example, he knew that there was a soul in his body that did not belong to this world. For example, he knew how a similar soul had appeared in this world in a moving manner and disappeared in this world in a heart-wrenching manner. These were all things that the omnipotent Qing emperor did not know. These were Fan Xian's trump cards. The emperor also did not know that his two greatest cards, the chest and Uncle Wu Zhu, had already left him and had gone somewhere unknown. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the sturdy royal palace across the long imperial road. His gaze went past the city walls and straight through the cold clouds in the sky. It was as if he could see some of the past from many years ago, as well as the bloody and fiery killing 2 years ago. The eunuchs and serving girls walking quietly inside the royal palace looked at the young man under Taiji Palace and quickly lowered their bodies in greeting. In their hearts, they were confused. Why was Sir Fan Jr. in a daze? Fan Xian's gaze pierced through the clouds and seemed to land on the distant snowy plains in the north. It was as if he saw a man with a black cloth over his eyes, carrying a chest, and walking alone and resolutely toward an unknown, wondrous place. Each step of that person broke through countless snowflakes. Each glance saw through endless illusions. Fan Xian smiled warmly in the shadows of the palace. He sincerely wished that Uncle Wu Zhu would be able to find him. This was perhaps the most important thing in his life. Presently, the restaurant with the best business in Jingdou was Yisher Tavern. Although the owner of this restaurant was no longer the Chui family under the protection of the eldest princess. A long time ago, the Chui family had been uprooted by the Overwatch Council for smuggling to northern Qi. But business here was as good as ever. Students of the Imperial College and scholars from other places liked to visit Dombo bookstore the most. It had to be known that under the strict crackdown of the 8th Bureau, there had been no aunties carrying children and selling little red books on the streets and alleys of Jingdou for many years. The inn with the best business was the Tongfu Inn. The tofu shop with the most customers was the private property of the Fan family. As for the brothel with the most business and the highest class, it was the Baoyue brothel. Traveling to Jingdou, now that things had changed, often consisted of eating at Yisher Tavern, staying at Tongfu Tavern, eating a bowl of tofu on the road, strolling in a Dombo bookstore to buy a couple of books, and at night going to Baoyue brothel to embrace a few beautiful women. Without a doubt, it was because of that person called Fan Xian. Yisher Tavern was the beginning of Fan Xian's legendary life. From Danzhou to Jingdou, his meeting with Crown Prince Jing and He Zhongwei began in this restaurant. Given the status of these three people, Yisher Tavern naturally had a magical feeling. Of course, the most important thing was that the story of Sir Fan Jr.'s Black Fist had shocked Jingdou. Through countless storytellers, it had spread throughout the world. Tongfu Tavern was the birthplace of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. The other 3 places were Fan Xian's property. Let's not repeat Fan Xian's string of halos, because it is a very tiring thing to do. One only needed to notice this fact to know Fan Xian's reputation and status in the entire Qin kingdom. There were many people who hated Fan Xian, and even more who loved him. But very few people were like the owner of the medical shop opposite Dombo bookstore, who had such complicated feelings toward him. The medical shop had just been bought and had not yet opened for business. The medicines seemed to be piled up in a messy but orderly fashion. A girl wearing a plain-colored brocade robe was supporting her chin in a daze in the room filled with the smell of medicine. She did not notice that there were already too many random people gathered outside the medical shop. If it weren't for the manor guards and secret Overwatch Council agents blocking them, those people would probably have long squeezed into the medical shop. Master Ku He's last disciple, the young lady of the Fan family with astonishing medical skills, and Sir Fan Jr.'s favorite sister, had finally left Qing Mountain and returned to her hometown of Jingdou. Under the surprised gazes of the Jingdou people and the room filled with the strange smell of medicine, she began to miss certain people. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.